everybody, and welcome back to Nefarious TV. This is it, guys. The moment we've all been waiting for. The collection is here. We ended up with 25 narrators and a whole lot of amazing writers. I just want to start by thanking every single one of you that got involved in this project. Those of you that shared it, joined it, or even just got excited about it, it truly means the world to me. And I also want to thank all of the bigger channels that accepted this invitation when I didn't even have 50 subs. You all could have laughed in my face and decided that this was a waste of time, but instead I was met with open arms, advice, and a genuine excited attitude. This project was the first thing that I started working on with this channel, and in the process, I have made some amazing friends, and it has given me a chance to really explore and delve into this awesome community further. So though Nefarious TV isn't primarily a story narration channel, this is very important to me, and I'll be forever grateful for each and every one of you that contributed something to it. And if you didn't make it onto this one because you didn't see the call for writers or narrators, don't worry. I'm planning on doing another one later this year or possibly next year. You guys can send me submissions anytime and I will store them away for part 2. So with all of that being said, here's to all of us, and let's begin.
Hello everyone, Night Terror here, and before I get started, I wanted to say a huge thank you to Nef for putting together such an amazing collaboration. There are so many talented narrators in this community, and I hope that if you're listening to this, you'll do them all a favour by stopping by their channel and dropping them a subscribe. And with that being said, today's story is by author SkullnBones Horror. Seppuku. A rusted metal sign sits outside a small, secluded theatre buried deep within the desolate parts of Manhattan. Men and women, elegantly garbed in expensive attire, gather in front, their cheerful expressions hidden behind beautifully embellished masquerade masks. One by one, they load into the theatre, taking their seats in front of a massive stage cloaked behind black curtains. Boisterous laughter and oral conversions fill the room as an out-of-sight stagehand hastily draws the curtains. The room falls silent as it becomes shrouded in darkness, the lights flickering back to life moments later, unveiling a woman dressed in black. A hushed reticence bowls over the crowd as the woman begins to speak, her words fervid and robust. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to our bi-monthly showcase. I hope you all enjoy the performances we have for you today, as each one promises to be more unique than the last. 5 performers will be giving it their all today, and when the time comes, we will all vote for our favourites. Now, let the show begin. The theatre roars in thunderous applause as the woman takes her leave from the stage. A woman much younger than the first wanders onto the stage, carrying an onyx violin case. She bows and then fishes the violin from its case. Readying the bow, she begins a tear-jerking, melodic song. The bow dances along the steel strings as warm tears leak down her face. The crowd watches on as her song grew more passionate. A clash of metals reverberate through tempestuous strokes, silk strands of alloy strip from their surface, floating to the ground like weightless strands of hair. A spotlight beams in her direction, reflecting off a makeshift razor cemented to the bow. Bloody lacerations litter her face as the blade swipes across it. With one final stroke, the blade connects with her windpipe, slicing into her trachea like a slab of raw meat. With one final breath, she collapses to the floor, her violin landing in a small pool of blood. The theatre stared on in suffocating silence as the woman was dragged off stage, streaks of blood brightly decorating the hardwood floor. The curtains close and then reopen after several minutes, revealing a middle-aged man dressed in the tattered rags of a jester. A wooden table seated close to him, painted with an arsenal of gadgets. He swipes his hand slowly over the collection, carefully hand-picking his weapons of choice. He gathers them in his hands, 2 daggers in one, and a knife in the other. He tosses them into the air, catching them with incredible accuracy. One by one, the instruments of torture carried from one hand to the other, transforming into tiny acrobatics fluttering through the air in a display of finesse and poise. The jester soon finishes his first act, arching his body in the direction of the crowd's idolatory praise. He quickly switches out the daggers, plucking 3 petrol-coated blades from the table and setting them ablaze. A flamboyant spectacle of pirouetting flames prance around in a twirling waltz, merging into a swirling frolic of heated coils. With a simple flick of the wrist, he tosses them into the air, the blades spinning to a fatal point as he bows towards the crowd. The glowing knives pierce his skull and neck, sliding through his muscle and cartilage, singeing third-degree burns into his flesh. He falls to the hardwood floor, his bloodshot eyes still fixed upon the mystified audience as he's dragged away. The curtains drew to a close once more before revealing a young girl no older than 16. Neon silk ribbons dangled from the ceiling several feet above the ground. Her sequined dress glistened in the glowing illumination of the spotlight as she climbed about the woven threads, the cloth swaying slightly from her movements. She tangles the cloth around her body, lifting herself higher above the ground, her fluid motions synchronized to the balletic melodies sounding in the background, her body contorting and bending into a voiceless narration of heart-wrenching despondence. In one swift movement, she loops the cloth around her throat and waist, twisting her body around the fabric and twirling expertly down the ribbon. Her neck fractures under the stringent tug of the fabric, her body convulsing in spastic fails before calmingly coming to a terrifying halt. As the curtains crept to a close, the woman in the black dress once again makes her appearance onto the stage. I hope you're all enjoying our show tonight. After all, it's the least we can do since our performers are giving up so much. Our last performance of the night will be a duet, but the contestants will both be judged individually on their craft. After the performance, those of you watching will be asked to cast your vote. I hope you all make the right choice. Now, let the show continue. She quickly walks off stage, the curtains opening moments later to reveal a man and a woman, their hands cupped together, wedding bands adorning their ring fingers. An assortment of metal straps and horizontal bars hovered above them, high platforms stretched towards the netless beams. They run towards their opposite platforms, quickly climbing up the metal rungs and hoisting themselves onto the scaffolding. They untie the beams from their resting place and jump from the platforms, expertly lifting themselves onto the steel rods as they began swaying violently. They hook their legs onto the bar, their bodies dangling beneath its hold as they force it swing further, lessening the distance between them. With incredible timing, their outstretched hands meet. The husband's hands clutch tightly around his wife's as she disentangles her legs from the crossbar. She forces her body upwards, grabbing hold of the bar, pulling herself up towards the metal ropes holding them in place. She fixes her feet atop the metal rod as her husband slides down, pinning his ankles against the gelid alloy. Almost synonymously, they begin a wondrous spectacle of aerial twists, shifting and contorting their bodies in aeronautical pinwheels, soaring through the air like a sharpened blade through tissue paper. A flawless display of agility and strength is halted with a passionate kiss, their hands clutching one another's as they loosen their grip on the rod, falling to the unforgiving ground below. Fragile cracks escape broken bones, transforming their bodies into flaccid dolls as they grew motionless. Pools of blood escape their orifices and collect en masse around them. The curtain closed for the last time as the woman in black steps out onto the stage. I hope you all enjoyed our show for you today. We thank all of our performers for taking part in this historic production. I'd like to ask all of those watching to now cast your vote for the most creative death. The one with the most votes will be used as our official sacrifice. Thank you for watching. See you next time. The camera pans out, scanning over an applauding audience as credits scroll across the screen. Mouse clicks pollute the air as a pop-up takes its place. The voting tally climbing to almost 10,000.
My brother is 7 years older than me. So when I was around 9 or 10, he was in high school and had to hide from our parents that he smoked and dipped tobacco. As a result, most days of the week after he got home from school, as I was homeschooled, we'd go out into the woods for an hour or two. We lived way out in the country, in an already rural part of East Texas, so there were plenty of woods to explore. The land south of our house was all owned by a mining company, and my parents didn't want us going out there. So we always crossed a fence to the north of our house and explored the woods out there. Very likely, someone's local property that we had no business being on. But when you live out in the country, you figure you'll have plenty of sign before you accidentally walk into someone's backyard. After a few months of venturing out in this area, we never travelled more than an hour's distance from our house, and always in daylight. We decided one day we'd just keep walking and walking. My brother smoked and spat into a Dr. Pepper bottle. We entered big pastures and drove back into even deeper woods. Whenever we talked about it, we've always said that we must have travelled at least a mile, but we usually say far more. Eventually, we came across a circular pond. I distinctly remember having a much higher rim on one side, and my brother explained that was because a tractor had dug it out and piled up more dirt on one side than the other. We kept on going past the pond and entered another patch of wood, and we came out and saw that the tree line curved around sharply to the right, and the clearing we now stood in opened up far wider. We went in that direction, and while my memory of getting there is a little hazy, I know that we suddenly came across a very large white building surrounded by a high fence. There was a gate large enough for vehicles to move in and out, and a dirt road leading away from the facility. We could hear the sounds of activity and could see people walking around the outside of the fence near the gate. I'm afraid any other details I could give at this point might be coloured by false memory or exaggerations from an imaginative young brain. At that moment, we both felt the spine-tingling terror, alerting the body that something about this was very wrong, and that we were not supposed to be here. We were at least going to get in very serious trouble. We were standing in the middle of a clearing, gawking at a facility of some kind on what was obviously someone else's property. We were seeing something deep out in the woods that we had never known was here. All this time we'd spent walking around these woods. If we had just gone a little ways further, we would have stumbled across this. I remember standing there for a moment longer, asking my brother what this could possibly be. He told me something along the lines of, "I have no clue, but we really should get out of there." The tone of his voice truly freaked me out, as I remember running back hard the way we came, crossing the same pond and cutting a path as close as possible to the route we had travelled. When we finally stopped, out of breath, my brother told me that there was no way, shape or form that we could utter a word of this to our parents. They were spankers, and awful grounders, and he knew the trouble he'd be in for taking his little brother into what was quite possibly danger. After that day, we kept going out in those woods, but never that far. Eventually, my brother got caught with a can of skull, and my dad made him eat the whole can and puke it up on the porch. Being an easily intimidated little kid, it wasn't hard to get more information out of me than my brother's smoking and dipping habits. But I never brought up the facility we found. Over the years, my brother and I had brought it up many times. Our parents had gotten way laxer since we'd all grown up, and we even told them the story, to my mother's retroactive shock. We've added a lot of other weird ones to our arsenal in the time, as our family has always lived by huge areas of land for us to wander around. But this one would always be our favourite. It's always, remember the time we almost got killed by those government researchers? Remember the time we found that crazy building in the woods with people walking around it? But for the past few days, this event has been really bugging me. I had told my wife about it in detail, and she was pretty amused. I thought I'd look around in Google Maps a bit. Something I'm honestly surprised I'd never done before. And what I found, or haven't found, is really bizarre. Moving north from my old house, which has since burnt down and left an ugly scar on the satellite image, I can clearly make out the woods we spent our time in. When I go further north, I see several large clearings, followed by more wooded area. Eventually, I even found the circular pond, and I'm positive I can make out the higher end of the pond that we stood on as my brother explained how it had been made. When I drag the map further up, I see what looks to be the clearing and the sharp curve of the tree line to where we saw this facility. But there's nothing there. No trace of a building, no evidence of a dirt road leading away from an old structure. It's just pastures and more trees. In fact, when I zoom out and look at the whole area, it doesn't seem possible for there to have been an operation of that scale that we saw. Just a little ways further north, the land becomes nothing more but a pasture, with houses pressed up against a country road. For people to have come and gone from this area, they would have had to have made roads of some kind, as well as power lines stretching out to the building. But there's nothing like that on Google. In fact, there really is no, here it was, spot on the map. It's like it was never there to begin with. It's been a few years since I've talked about it. So I texted my brother earlier today, asking him if he still remembered what happened. He called me immediately after and said, "Hell yeah, that was a really weird day." You know how good I used to be in those woods, but that shit really freaked me out, and we had to get out of there. The whole event feels more like something that we walked into that we shouldn't have seen. I still remember the feeling of dread upon finding the place, and knowing that something bad would happen if we stuck around. I've decided I'm gonna message my brother and see if maybe he's up for one last walk in the woods to see if we can get to the bottom of this once and for all.
My name is Colin Watson. Last night, I murdered my dad's oldest friend in the driveway of my own home. I was interviewed by police several times and didn't say a single solitary utterance to them. But now, I will tell you why I killed him. Jimmy Matthews sent me to the same schools as my dad, the pair of them being best friends all throughout primary and secondary school. They worked together briefly on a construction site when they left school at 16, but Jimmy left for Korean physiotherapy upon acceptance into Polytechnic College at the end of the 1970s. They kept in touch regardless, which led to Jim visiting our family home all through my childhood. Despite being a popular figure in our home, I dreaded Jimmy's visits, for in between conversation and coffee with my parents, Jim would chase me around the house, threatening to tickle me. Calling himself Tickle Jim, he would adopt a silly voice, following me from room to room, growling as I barely avoided being cornered by him. One November evening when I was 11, Jimmy arrived looking pretty run down. I remember the conversation with my parents was pretty serious. It was one of the only times they shut the kitchen door when Jim was around. Evidently, they were having an exclusively adult conversation on a subject very serious to them. When Jim emerged from the kitchen for his ritual tickle chase, he seemed very different. His jovial disposition was replaced by a harsher one. I was so scared that I ran and hid behind the living room couch. I lay in the tiny gap between the couch and the wall for longer than I cared to admit, barely breathing as I listened to Tickle Jim silently searching the house for me. The only thing I could see was the small crack at the end of the couch. A minuscule view of the room is all that availed me. So it was that I froze in pure fear when Jim's eye appeared in the crack. Something was off about them, oddly shaped and out of proportion to his face. With a groan of what I swore was hunger, his fingers began to creep into crack between the couch and the wall, creeping even further, until I realized in absolute terror that they seemed to be stretching on their own. The knuckles elongated, the bones seemed to crack and twist as his vile digits continued to probe for me. I struggled and squirmed, trying to avoid them at all costs, yet it wasn't long for they found their mark, vibrating against my skin as a white-hot pain shot through me. I screamed with all my might. I screeched and squealed at the sight of his jagged nails, marking my skin, bruising them, little specks of blood forming around the places of contact. My parents burst in, snatching me up and away from Jim, as an argument soon unfolded on appropriate behavior around their children. Jim was thrown out, and that was the last time I ever saw him. Until last night. A knock at the door at around 7 in the evening had me puzzled. We weren't expecting visitors, and no one around rural Edinburgh knocks unannounced past a certain time. Yet stood at the door, barely aged since I'd last seen him nearly 20 years ago, was Tickle Jim. "Hello, Colin," he said curtly. "I heard about baby Grace being born. Congratulations. I'll be sure to pay her a visit sometime." I couldn't find the words as Jim turned and made his way back up my driveway, a sick smile on his lips. I simply took the baseball bat reserved for burglars from the porch and followed Jim to his car. A few hours later, I watched in handcuffs from the back of a police car as paramedics covered Jim's lifeless body with a sheet before packing him into the back of an ambulance. I didn't say a word to the interviewing police, as they kept me in the cell overnight. The only words fit to leave my mouth were, "He threatened my daughter." But I still kept quiet. How could they know? How could they possibly understand? But as morning came around, I was stunned when this stony-faced officer unlocked my cell and informed me I was free to leave. When I asked one of the arresting officers why I was being released, he looked at me in a way which chilled me to the core. This barely bearded Scottish officer looked like a scared child. It was the newspaper headline on the long walk home that has me typing this up right now. It took me a while to shake off the trembling and down a few drams of whiskey before I had the presence of mind to relate this tale to you. But there are no words to describe the abject terror I felt when I read the bold-faced type on the front cover of the Daily Standard. Ambulance crash horror leaves 3 dead, corpse apparently stolen. So tell me, r/NoSleep, how do I protect my daughter from something I can't kill?
There's a lot of things people in the big city don't think about. They don't think about the trees, the mountains, the animals, and least of which, us. Us being the people from these woodsy boondocks. Those of us who dig and claw our way through our simple lives among the rocks and trees of these isolated oases. It's not often you hear about us rural folk breaking the bonds of our rustic existence and flourishing in your metropolitan paradise. But it's not from a lack of trying. Like many of us, I dreamed big, imagined myself a shining star among the dull bulbs of my town. I'm gonna move out west, get famous. That's what I told myself for years and years, until the light in my eyes died. Rather, I suppose you could say it was snuffed. I hail from a desolate Kentucky town named Harlan, an uncompromising community that's hanging on by a single thread. I'd give it a good decade before we're nothing but a canopied crater killed by our own disillusion and turned into a skeletal silhouette taken over by the rampant kudzu. We make our meager living as miners mostly. It wasn't uncommon for my dad to make his way home covered head to toe in coal dust, a living shadow, hacking and wheezing, but giving us everything we needed to survive, if only barely. Until the day he didn't come home. Cave-ins weren't a rarity, but they were something we didn't like to think about. It was like we saw the earth as some beast, some unknowable being that held no power over us as we carved out its rocky cadaver to make our living. Ignore the monster, be brave, and it won't be able to hurt you. But it could. It did. When Dad died, things took a turn downwards. I was still a kid. Death isn't something you can truly process when you're an 8-year-old coming to grasp with the concept of your father existing solely as an unrecognizable pile of fleshy rubble in a pine box. What I knew, what I understood, was that everyone dealt with this hateful specter called death in their own way. I didn't understand how destructive these means of coping could be. My mother did what many of our neighbors had done, and many still do. She turned to drugs. After years of seeing many of my friends and family wither into nothing but bony scaffolding supporting sagging, vaguely human skins, I had learned what walking this path did to people. But back then I had no idea. Back then, all my worries were born of the earth, of my life. Human terrors, things I could escape from. So I ran. At 16, I gave up. I ran from the mountain that took my father and the poison that morphed my mother into a monster. That monster followed. I still remember the day it happened. I see it in my nightmares and in these mountains every day. I ran along the creek bed, dried up in the summer sun, more bed than creek, I suppose. The hardened mud cracked and shifted beneath my feet as I bolted along this ditch of a path, twigs snapping behind me, following by shrill roars. "Wyatt, stop!" My mother's voice bounced between the trees. "You can't run away from this!" I didn't let it deter me. She was a person. She was a person, once anyway. People can't stop me now. I turned tail for one moment to confront this lanky beast that was once my mother. I looked her in the eyes, opened my mouth, relived every angry practice session of shouting and crying in front of my mirror, preparing for this moment. But as she passed beneath the train trestle that stretched to either side of the creek, I saw it. I saw it, and I lost every word I had begged my mind to let me remember. There it was, motionless on the trestle, watching me with an eyeless stare. A massive creature casting its loomy shadow over my mother. Its head was that of a skinned stag, ivory white bones casting a harsh reflection. Its massive antlers arched inward like a barbed crown. The creature seemed to encompass everything I had grown to hate about this land, as if it had been carved from the mountain itself. It stood there, powerful and imposing. Its broad shoulders led to branch-like appendages adorned with braided willow stems, forming makeshift wings. At its base, beneath its rocky core, was an ever-streaming leakage of mud dripping to the ground beneath. Couldn't Mom see this thing? This mountainous monster dripping its sludgy mass above her just stood there, and as if she was aware of its presence but unsure of quite how, she stopped. We stood there, staring at each other with this bizarre being intruding on our catharsis until the silence broke. I know things went wrong. I know everything I've done was wrong, but you have to listen to me, my mother pleaded as she wept. Come back to me. Come to Mama. You can't understand. You can't run. I said nothing. Her words lit a fire in me. You can't run. Like hell I can't. I'm sick of this place, these people, sick of her. Suddenly, it was as if the monstrous being was no longer there. I saw it. Of course, I knew it was watching, but the anger I felt managed to trump the fear of this god-like behemoth. I turned heel to continue my escape. Years worth of rage welled up inside me, and my eyes started to blur with tears. I couldn't run. She was right. It was like a living hell, as if a mountain had stealthily sprung up in my path. The creature stared at me as much as it could, stare with the blackened voice where its eyes should have been. It pointed behind me, toward Mom. I hated her, what she had become, but on some level that kind of love doesn't die, and that tiny bit of love in the bottom of my heart forced me to turn around. I saw her there, kneeling beneath the trestle. A thunderous rattling shook the trees around us as birds clamored for safety in all directions. The racket was unbelievable. I couldn't imagine what abomination was making its way toward us. Why wasn't she moving? The beast had arrived, bellowing smoke and warping the trees and jarring the earth. When my rational mind managed to seize control in this otherworldly moment, I realized what it was. A train. The same kind that crossed that bridge day in and day out, hauling the latest spoils of our surviving miners' toil. I was relieved, but quickly realized that while this monster was in my head, the one hovering over me was very real. Its pointed hand still aimed squarely at my mother. I watched helplessly as it proved its mastery over our world through unseen means. The trestle moaned and creaked, nuts and bolts freeing themselves by either the creature's ethereal tendrils or the train's power. The method didn't matter. The bridge was giving way. Kneeling and broken, my mother waited. The train didn't. Its massive bulk stressed the already ailing bridge, and before long it all came crashing down. It's been years since my encounter that day. I haven't tried to flee this backwoods hell again, but Lord knows I thought about it. With every thought, my memories grew more vivid. The creature's face burned itself into my mind as if it was actively reminding me of what'll happen should I try to leave again. I could see this face everywhere, inside and out, as it would form itself into being in everything from the branches above to the dirt below. I spoke to others about my experience at first. Their reactions were interesting to say the least. No one denied the existence of our malevolent guardian, but no one spoke of it in definite terms either. I learned nothing about this being, not where it came from, nor how my people had become its playthings. Some long-forgotten pact with a dead god or ritual gone awry, locking us in this dried-up husk of a town. Frankly, I don't care anymore. It seemed that my whole town was aware of our invisible cage, but no one seemed interested in breaking out of it. I began to feel like an imprisoned animal watched over by an overzealous master. Like most mangy, mistreated animals kept bound by their owners, I began to feel the pathetic acceptance of my place in this cage grow into a burning desire to escape. As I tried to do so many years ago, I'm getting away from here. I'm getting in my car, heading for the county line, and not stopping no matter what. No man or beast will slow me down, no haint or eldritch horror either. As I sped down the decaying mountain pass, I saw the trees to my left shake as if threatening me. Saw the mountains to my right begin to crack and fray with anger. It was coming. I made a harsh turn, clipped the guardrails, and began bouncing from lane to lane, trying desperately to regain control. When I finally reached my destination, as if I had any belief to the contrary, it was waiting for me. I saw it miles away, nothing but a straight line separating us. I stopped to survey my situation, but found no obvious means of avoidance. With no other route available, I took that empty, desolate road despite the living roadblock ahead of me. My clunker of a car whined and ached as I slammed down the pedal and accepted my fate. The creature didn't move. It rooted itself to the earth below and waited. I wasn't going to stop no matter how sure it seemed that I would. Was it confident in its power over me? Or did it just know it could stop me? I didn't care, didn't have time to. The thing grew in my center of vision as I drew closer and closer to it. It's even bigger than I remember. But I won't stop. I can't. It was like running headfirst into a brick wall. All I heard was the deafening boom of the collision. All I saw was the shredded remains of my car, ripped up, burnt, and strewn across the highway. It's impossible to imagine the power of something strong enough to practically disintegrate a vehicle like that, but that thing wasn't of this world. It didn't play by our rules. In the calamity and noise, I had managed to distract myself from the pain. Truthfully, I didn't feel much of anything, but the crimson puddle beneath me indicated that I had suffered some kind of injury. I knew it was mine. That thing didn't bleed. That thing. Where was it? I forced myself out of the haze. My eyes darted across the skyline looking for my unwanted guardian angel. There it was, same place it stood moments before, staring at me as it had always. I'd failed. I lay dying in a puddle of my own disappointment, just enough time to reflect on this increasingly regrettable decision. But something was different. The thing was, well, it's hard to say hurt, given the abilities it had displayed, but it was upset, to say the least. Still, as a statue, but subtly trembling with anger. Had I just pissed off a god? That's not something you walk away from, I'd imagine. I waited for the killing blow, but nothing came. Then I saw it. The proverbial light at the end of the tunnel. The road sign I had passed on the way, its green glimmer had caught my eye for a brief moment. That glimmer was gone. In its place was a worn, blank silver. It's the other side. I'm on the other side, out of the county. I won! I'm bleeding like a stuck pig, but I won. The thing glared at me, couldn't tell if it was shaking from the impact or the anger it felt over my victory. Didn't matter either way. For all I knew, I had 5 minutes left on this earth, and if I spent those 5 minutes rubbing this moment in the face of the monster that's kept me caged my whole life, then I could die happy. A piercing noise pulled me away from my gloating. Sirens. I managed to contort my neck and tear my eyes from my foe. An ambulance, cops, my rescue, my salvation. I had won! It was over. There's a lot of things I don't think about anymore. I don't think about the mountains, the animals, the trees. I don't miss any of it. But there are still people there. People that are suffering. And no matter what happens to me from now on, I'll never stop thinking of them. What's up guys, Eden here, and thanks for listening. Feel free to check out my channel at Studio Eden 2 on YouTube. And if you have any interesting stories to send me, feel free to check out the Reddit, Studio Eden Library, post stories there, or feel free to email me them at studio.of.eden@gmail.com.
The First World War was perhaps the most devastating conflict in human history, claiming the lives of over 18 million soldiers and civilians across the world. The war was so utterly cataclysmic that there is an entire section of northeastern France that has been declared unfit for human habitation. La Zone Rouge, or the Red Zone, originally covered more than 460 square miles and was deemed too physically and environmentally damaged by conflict to sustain life. Rather than attempt to immediately clean up the former battlefields, the French government allowed the land to return to nature. Supposedly, the area is littered with unexploded ordnance, including many poison gas shells, still deadly after more than 100 years. However, what's talked about even less is the disproportionate number of soldiers, both Allied and German, that went missing in the zone, particularly around the area of Malancourt. Stories of desertion and madness were rife at the time. It was not unusual for a man to simply walk from his post, never to be seen again. Men would simply vanish during an attack, as if snatched up by the forest itself. To the French, they are known simply as La Disparus, or the Disappeared. Being somewhat of an armchair historian, I decided to break free from the comforts of my quaint English home to see if I couldn't solve the mystery all by myself. It has been the biggest mistake of my life. At first, my guide was fairly enthusiastic. Manu, a Verdun local, would show me the green fields so scarred by shelling that they looked like the surface of the moon. Crater after crater, filled with the remnants of the autumn rains, made the place look hauntingly surreal. One pile of broken tree limbs turned out to be made entirely of rusting rifles, warped and misshapen from 100 years of being exposed to the elements. Yet, as we ventured further into the forbidden territory of the Red Zone, he grumbled in low French as we trudged through the mist of a muddy, half-dead forest as we passed huge, rusting piles of empty artillery shells. He would freeze at each snapping twig or rustle of leaves around us before giving me a nervous look, hissing something about les forêts du Marthomes and how the animals here weren't right. After a while he slowed, refusing to continue before snatching the wad of currency from my hands and scarpering back the way we came. It was easy to understand why he was so anxious. An overgrown, almost enchanted-looking forest where the wrong footfall meant losing your leg, or worse, your life. It was at this point I pulled out a small, retractable metal detector from my rucksack, powering it up before sweeping the ground before me as I walked. It was my turn to freeze in terror when a huge rumbling in the earth set my heart racing. I understood that the French army was still in the process of clearing unexploded ordnance from the area, so it was not entirely out of question that what shook the ground was a simple, controlled detonation. With that in mind, I kept going, thrilled when I came across an abandoned series of trenches. Still moving carefully forward, the metal detector sweeping a safe path before me, I tried to pull out my iPhone to snap a few pictures of the rotten structure, overgrown with moss and other such plant life. Confused, I stared at my phone's screen, watching as a strange, metallic pulse seemed to wash across what would be an otherwise crystal-clear display. Something was playing havoc with the electronics of my device, slowing it down, making the screen stutter. Suddenly, the metal detector beeped, first once, then twice, before continuously beeping erratically. I pointed it at previously cleared areas, yet it still droned on incessantly, the tinny, irritating sound amplified by the shape of the trench. I started to feel nauseous, a feeling that came on so strong and suddenly that saliva cascaded from my lips before I brought up my lunch. My skin itched, My ears rang with the screeching of the metal detector, and my hair began to stand on end as if from some electrical static. I dropped the detector and tried to run, but I bent double, vomiting again, retching feebly as I stumbled back along the muddy foliage-infested trench. I tried not to look in the dugout. I swear it's like I could feel the evil that it contained as I lurched past it, a deep dread that made me aware that the source of my sickness was hidden inside its dark, crypt-like cranny. But I did. I looked, and what I saw haunts me. A mass of scarred, pockmarked flesh, barbed wire twisting and writhing like tentacles around a huge, bulbous body, impossibly huge for such a tiny, cramped space. It was covered in eyes, 1,000 different eyes of all shapes and colors. Some wept openly, pouring bloody pus down the ungodly, fleshy mass. They were the eyes of the disappeared. They screamed at me silently in the twilight, screamed silently in some ancient tongue that seemed to penetrate my skull as I fled, wailing and crying through the forest. Until now, I've never told a soul of what I experienced there. World War I was one of the darkest periods of human history, but something darker lives in the abandoned trenches just less than 100 miles east of Paris. Something older than human history. I'm begging you, our NoSleep, don't go to the red zone. A huge thanks to Richie and Nefarious TV for allowing me to be a part of this project. It was really fun. If you like what you just heard, you might like my podcast. It's called Weird Darkness. There you'll find stories of the paranormal, supernatural, legends, lore, mysterious, macabre, unsolved, and unexplained. I have a new episode every day of the week. You can find out more and subscribe at WeirdDarkness.com.
I don't remember who I was or what I wanted. I can't remember any family or love I may have felt. I can't remember what it means to live at all. All that remains is a flickering image of blood and the brushstrokes of rage that persist within me. I remember only what I need to know, and as long as that story remains to tell, I refuse to rest. It was years ago. I can't remember where I was or what I was doing, but the echoes of joy adulterate the tragedy that is to come. The sun was high and my skin was scorched. The bittersweet memory of the lake's serenity remains like a bitter pill, mocking the image of the reflection of who I now choose to be. On that day, I think I must have been happy, the way my spirit sung, and the way the sky sparkled in the water. It was right. It must have been right. I was alone. I'll never know why, but I cared little. Resting upon the eave of the lake was a tiny cabin. Inside was everything I needed. How naive I must have been. Resting upon the bed, I cared little for whatever it was that I was hiding from. Life beyond that shack was meaningless. If only I could have stayed like that. Basking in the peace of silent serenity, the sun crossed from horizon to horizon, and as the sun decayed behind the blanket of forest, the sky blazed in scarlet majesty, permeating the land in bloody shadows and shifting phantoms. If I could have held the sun in my hands, I would have never let go. As the day's final embers petered into shadow, I found myself asleep. Damn you for closing your eyes. Damn the sun for leaving me that night. Damn him. Eventually I was awakened by the sound of frantic banging. Forcing my eyes open, I could see my door violently shaking. My heart must have been racing, but I can hardly remember. I don't remember what I did or what I felt beyond the fear. After a minute, the sound ceased. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't leave my room, but I couldn't stay. What should I have done? What could I do? Minutes later, I heard scratching on my walls, deep, haunting scrapes, like a knife grating against wood. Beyond my window shades, I could make out a large silhouette pacing between the window and door. After a few moments, he would fall silent again. I think I must have been softly weeping at this time, pressed against the corner of the room. I wanted to run out the back door, but I didn't know if I should. I still don't. A great deal of time had passed, and I couldn't hear anything. I think the silence must have disturbed me more than anything else up to that moment. And then, a huge bang startled me senseless. My door ripped out of its hinges, sending splinters flying across the room. Not even daring to look at whatever was there, I bolted for the back, ripping open the door and running into the night. I tried to move as fast as I could, but I was barefoot and slow. I ran and ran and I ran. I tried. God, I tried to move as fast as I could, but I could hear him behind me. Heavy steps, pounding the earth. As I ran, I grew slower. The ground was covered in moist pine needles that ripped open the soles of my feet, and the burning in my chest left me feeling faint. He was getting closer. I could hear his laborious panting, and the sounds of his steps, just a foot behind. "Don't kill me!" I screamed, but the man didn't care to listen. All of a sudden, I felt a painful sting behind my ear, and I watched as the world fell out from beneath me. Immediately, I felt a great weight crush me. Gasping for air, my face was pressed against the ground. Afterwards, I felt a thick hand grab me by my hair and nightgown, where he began to drag me back towards the cabin. Face down in the soil, I tried to scream, but my mouth was filled with bloody pine needles and dirt. I kicked and fought, but he was too strong. Dragging against the ground, my entire body was ripped open and sore. I tried to grab a rock to use as a weapon, but as I stretched out my body to reach for it, I felt my stomach snag on a root, tearing me open. After what felt like hours, we were back to the cabin by the lake. With a powerful force, he picked me off the ground, ripping out a great tuft of hair in the process, and tossed me onto the edge of the lake. Sobbing, I tried to run the second he let me go, but as I began to move, he kicked me in the stomach, knocking the wind out of me. He got on top of me and started tearing at my robe, but I clawed at his eye, tearing a huge gash across his face. He wasn't happy about that. A horrible look crossed his face, and he screamed this oddly high-pitched yelp as he began to bloody his fists against my face. I felt my teeth crack, and I heard a strange crunching sound as my vision went dark. When I awoke, my clothes had been ripped off clean, and he was on top of me, with robe in hand. My feet were already bound, and he was now working on my hands. I tried to struggle, but the second I moved, he grabbed me by the throat, crushing the life from me. He lifted me off my back, and for the first time, I looked him right in the eye, and I'll never forget what I saw. Never had I hated a face as much as I did that day. Dropping me, I heard a sickening crack as my head struck a stone. Seconds later, I could feel the back of my hair grow damp with blood. After tying my wrists together, I felt my body being dragged across the earth again. I was screaming as loud as I could. Tears and blood ran down my cheek, and my entire body ached. I was cold and wet and scared, so very scared. I pleaded for him to let me live. I begged him not to kill me, but I knew he would. God, just the memory sickens me. Eventually, all I was aware of was the sound of my body as it scraped against the earth. I think I may have been screaming, but I can't remember that much. As he pulled me closer to the water, I closed my eyes. I couldn't bear to see that man another time. I felt my body lifted into the air, and then I felt the wind as I was thrust forward. The world plunged into silence. I was sinking into the lake. I didn't notice before, but I had an anchor tied to my feet. I ripped and fought against my restraints, but it was all useless. As my body slowly descended further into the depths of the lake, I desperately tried to cling to the little oxygen I still had. I couldn't open my mouth. I couldn't let the water in. Save me. Please save me. That was the only hope I had. I wished for a miracle. I prayed for God to lift the body from the depths, but part of me knew that nothing could save me. As I slipped further beneath the waves, I gazed into the sky one last time. A twisted light broke through the water, blinding me. Realizing it was the moon, I was eclipsed by immense dread. I wondered if this was the last I would see of the sky, of life, and of beauty. As I mourned my death, there was someone else I thought of, someone I must have loved, but that love means nothing to me now. In that moment, the pressure became even more immense. Water rushed into my nose, burning as it went down, but I couldn't let go. I had to keep my mouth shut. I had to fight. My head was now pounding, and I was growing delirious. The pain in my chest was so immense, I couldn't concentrate on anything. I then started to feel an odd spasm inside my chest. My lungs were contracting and pulsating. It felt as if my insides were crawling. Please, don't. I remember thinking as my mouth was forced open. Water, with the force of a truck, plunged into my mouth, filling my lungs immediately. And God, the way it felt as the water rushed through me. It felt as if I was going to pop from the pressure. And worst of all, I was alive through it all. I could feel the water flowing through my body, and the way it burned as it dampened my heart. Eventually, my eyes grew cloudy and dark as the water seeped into my eyes. And that is the end. I think I was screaming, but a tortured gurgle was all I could make out, and my body was completely expunged of oxygen. I sank to the floor. Death was truly frightening. Following this day, I refused to leave. I wouldn't allow my soul to pass. I sat there and watched as my body slowly began to bloat and turn a horrible shade of green, but I couldn't look away. I couldn't forget. And now, this is where I remain. I still rest in that cabin and yearn for the sun to rise, but it never has. Soon, I would learn that I wasn't alone. Other poor souls wander this lake, all female. I can't interact with them. Hell, I can't even see them, but you can be damn sure that I can hear them. They moan through the night, lamenting their death and those who still live. However, I can't say I share their sorrow. They're weak. We're all weak. It's why we're dead. No, I don't lament those I've lost. I don't miss what I don't have. I choose to forget. I choose to leave them behind. I only lament those other weak souls who will surely wind up mourning the sun with me. I still see the man, even though the day never rises. He still visits every so often. I've watched him murder countless people, and I've grown weary of the sight. A man with eyes like that does not deserve to live. So now, I'm waiting. I rest above the gentle waves, watching for the man and his clueless victims. And when he comes again, I'll make him remember. I will haunt his days and rend the breath from his lungs, just as he did us. And as his eyes beg for reprieve, I'll take immense pleasure in plucking them from his damned skull, where I'll leave his body to descend. And as his corpse lies with every tormented soul he discarded in his bloody wake, I'll finally be content enough to forget his face and how he has haunted me. Until that day arrives, I'll never have peace. Until I murder the man who murdered me, I'll never remember.
My mother told me she was from the past. She was schizophrenic. It's a brain disorder. Makes you see and hear things that aren't really there. Most people have heard about it. Now, this might not make a lot of sense. It's a story that was told to me when I was a kid by a crazy person. But she was my mother, so I've thought about it a lot. There was a man, a long time ago, in 1932. I imagine him with a bushy mustache and a bowler hat, and all his clothes are brown. One night, while he slept, someone came in his room and cracked him open with a hatchet, bowler hat and all. Now his clothes were red. When his head split open, all the nightmares poured out and became real. Goblins, ghouls, the things that go bump. They all flew into the sky and put out the sun. After that, there was no day, and it was always night. See, she said, we don't live in now. The whole world is still back in 1932. We just don't realize it because we're all asleep. In the real world, it's always nighttime. Nothing we see with our eyes is real. It's all a fake, crazy dream everyone is having, together, a collective unconsciousness. Nightmares used to come as we slept. Now things are backwards, so we are always asleep. An adaptation to keep us safe, keep them away. Once the nightmares come out, they can only hurt us when awake. My schizophrenic mother told me she was from the past. It's probably best to not believe her stories. She told me she knew this because the man next to her woke up, and then she woke up. He woke up first, so the nightmares were already killing him. She picked up the lamp from the table next to the bed. In an attempt to knock herself back to sleep, she bashed herself and bashed herself and bashed herself in the head over and over and over again until her pretty face was a bloody pulp, like a pie-eating contest gone wrong. Her face was cherry pie now, a mess. She was still awake, and now she was all gooey. Once they'd picked the man's bones clean, they went for her. They started clawing inside, through her stomach to her guts. The pain was so intense that she passed out and didn't wake back up. Schizophrenically, my mother told me she was from the past. She said it was hereditarily passed. I don't think we should believe her. I mean, she used to say a lot of strange things. The more I think about what my mother told me, the more I wonder if she was right. I woke up last night at the height of a great depression. The bed that I woke in sat in a room that had 3 walls and no roof. I rolled off, and underneath, I stayed, and hours passed. I had no shoes. I had no food. I wore a bowler hat. The sun was gone, and the nightmares shone, their glowing red eyes down like spotlights from the skies, searching me out. In time, falling weary, sleep was finally found. It all makes sense now that I know I'll never wake up again. My schizophrenic mother was from the past. She's been dead most of my adult life, but she still remembers to call. In fact, she called this morning. She told me to tell you it's safe to wake up now. But if I were you, I wouldn't believe her. She was schizophrenic, after all.
Look, I don't want to bullshit you guys. When I first read this thing, I thought it was fake. A prank that some older grad students were playing on the new guy. I'm just starting as a lab assistant at a new university, so of course, one of the first jobs they had me do was clean out this disgusting lab down in the basement. Dust, cobwebs, mold, you name it, this place had it. While I'm down there, I noticed a small, leather-bound book hidden behind a desk in the far corner of the lab. I started thumbing through it, and realized that this is a personal journal from about 2014. As I read through, I went from perplexed to shocked to just incredulous. No fucking way something like this is real, and just lying around in an old lab? The thing is, the more I've asked around, the more seriously I started to take it. People speak in hushed tones whenever I ask them about it. Sometimes they just shut down the conversation completely. I did some digging on my own and found some pretty concerning news articles that seem to confirm at least parts of what's in here. So I'm left in this position of not knowing what to believe. The one thing I am sure of is that this story belongs here. I'll let you guys be the judge for it yourselves. March 24th, 2014. Well, this has been a long time coming. I've been keeping a lab book for so long, it only feels right that I should keep a more personal account of my work. Something as historic as what I'm doing deserves a more personal touch. This could be a defining moment for humanity. Everyone deserves to know the story behind it. Who knows, maybe I could even publish this journal after all is said and done. Regrettably, I don't have much to start things with. Today was a boring day, although I feel like good news is on the horizon. Most of my grant money has been secured, and Dr. Smalls seems to have no interest in ever visiting the lab. This is fine by me, the privacy suits me well. I'm sure by the end of the week, I'll have more to report. March 26th, 2014. Ask and ye shall receive. I predicted good news was on the horizon, but this is almost too much. About 20 miles outside of town, a young man was speeding down the highway before colliding with a deer. The windshield shattered and decapitated the boy. However, because he hit the brakes early, the car grinded to a stop quickly, and it left his torso completely intact. How lucky can you get? The perfect age, the perfect build, dying with his torso undamaged. I thought I would have to wait months for something like this. But God, I suppose, had other plans. What's more, they kept the body in a small funeral home with almost non-existent security. Breaking in proved to be the easiest part. Back when I was gathering the limbs, I only ever needed to make the 1 or 2 cuts for easy transport. A full torso, of course, required 4. Thankfully, they hadn't tried to reattach the head. Otherwise, things might have been a bit messier. I was particularly sloppy with this one, and I know I'll have to do some trimming tomorrow to make sure everything fits properly. Time was of the essences, and I found the torso a particularly difficult nuisance to maneuver. Still, after a night like this, it's hard to feel upset. Progress just leapt forward by a few months. March 28th, 2014. Things continue to go well. After cleaning the torso more thoroughly, I checked the organs, and they all seem to be in good working order. The limbs are also a good fit, and the only one I still need to sew up is the left arm. The body is almost complete. My chemicals have also begun arriving. Full synthesis is predicted to take about 2 weeks or so for the batch size I will require. Once it's done, however, it should keep for the next several months. I don't want any of it to go to waste, but with my current streak of luck, I don't think I need to worry. The only thing holding up progress now was the head. I haven't been thinking about this for so long, I'm worried I might never be satisfied. Understandably, the head is the most important aspect of the subject. Wasting this on a complete moron could lead the whole project to ruin. But how can I ensure quality for something like this? Interviewing subjects is out of the question. It sickens me to admit, but at points I've considered volunteering a few colleagues of mine. They're smart men and would certainly understand the importance of my work, but I just can't bring myself to taint the project with murder. There is enough baggage as is. The newspaper article about the break-in on Wednesday seemed to connect it to my previous work from a few months back. I can only assume the police have also made the connection. Nothing in the article seemed to point to a lead, but that hasn't stopped my paranoid thoughts. I'm so close to finishing, I can't have them interfering yet. What I've done so far is sickening, but once everything is said and done, they'll all understand. I wish I could change their minds before that, convince them that what I'm doing is for the best. But alas, I'm not God. Not yet. April 15th, 2014. Been a while since my last update, but things only recently began to pick up. I suppose I'll start with the smaller developments and work my way up. I've begun synthesizing the compound in a usable dosage, and it should hopefully be ready within the next 3 days. This is by far the largest batch I've ever had to cook up, so I'm hoping that all remains stable. Further, I'm hoping that it will be finished soon, because it seems that a candidate for the head has been chosen for me. I'll keep his name a secret for now, out of respect for the dead, but he was a graduate student at the university, a brilliant philosophy student from what I understand, whom God himself saw fit to curse with lymphoma. His sickness has been the talk of campus for quite some time, and I'll admit to considering him prior to today's news. A sharp mind whose sickness did nothing to diminish it. It's a perfect head. Most faces around campus were solemn and grim as the news spread, while I had to work hard to conceal my grin. They believe his time in academia is over, but I know it's only beginning. My only fear is that this heist may be too close to home. The police must be building a case, and this could lead them right to the university and my lab. I won't allow this paranoia to stop me, however. My work is too important and too close to completion for me to hesitate now. By tomorrow night, I'll have my head. April 16th, 2014. I have to apologize for my handwriting tonight. I'm still shaking quite a bit. I've retrieved the head, although things were not as smooth as I hoped. I parked at the gas station over half a mile from the morgue. It must have been about 10 at night. This was closer to home than any of my previous heists, and I needed to be extra cautious with how I moved. Wearing a black hoodie, I slipped into the morgue using a staff entrance around the back. There were no security cameras at this facility, so I had nothing to worry about on that front. Things were almost too easy at this point. The cold air of the storage room hit me immediately as I entered. My clothing shielded me from the worst of it, but I still found it hard to suppress my shivers. It seemed colder than the other morgues I had visited. This must have been an omen. Labels adorned the storage units, so no time was wasted on finding him. My troubles began when I started to remove the head. There are far more veins and arteries leading to the head than any of the limbs, meaning splatter is a larger problem. My gloves were insufficient for keeping me clean, and I soon felt his blood soaking into my sleeves. Second, the thickness and malleability of the neck were also issues. It would wiggle in my grasp as I sawed through, meaning the cut is anything but neat. I'm hoping I can compensate when attaching to the torso. But all told, this will not be as pretty as I once hoped. The true trouble came late in the process, however. As I worked furiously to break through the spine, a noise caught my attention. Outside the room, descending the stairs into the basement, I heard footsteps. Quiet at first, but approaching quickly. There was a guard on duty. My breathing cut short as I struggled to think of a plan. My mind swam with ideas, and I was forced to act without thinking. Before the man made it down the stairs, I dropped my saw and bolted for the corner of the room nearest the door. The body lay flat on the table, its head dangling at an almost comical angle over the side. One of those sights where it's hard to tell if you should laugh or vomit. I held my breath and gripped tightly at the large flashlight I had brought with me. The footsteps inched closer and closer until they were right at the door. There was a small viewing window on the door, giving a person a preliminary view of the room before entering. I could tell that the guard was examining the situation. In one swift motion, the guard sprang through the door and did what I both hoped and dreaded. The poor, simple fool rushed to the body, leaving me behind him. I didn't hesitate. Before he even reached the table, I was on him, swinging the flashlight down on his head in a violent arc. The noise it made as the metal collided with his skull will forever haunt me. How the light seemed to leave his eyes from the final look of horror as his body crumbled to the floor. The way his head bounced off of the hard concrete several times before finally becoming motionless. I didn't wait to check on him. There was no time. I almost ripped the head off of then and there before shoving it into my bag. As I left the room, I gave his body one final look. His face seemed lifeless, and a pool of blood was slowly forming below it. I have tried to tell myself all night that I saw motion in his chest, but I'll never truly be sure. I pulled the fire alarm and hoped first responders would arrive well after I had left. These events have weighed heavily on me for the entire night. What acts I have taken in the name of science and progress. I always came to the same conclusion, however. What I'm doing is necessary. It is impossible to weigh the life of one against the lives of countless. When my work is complete, I'll have solved the greatest problem mankind has ever faced. Nothing will be able to compare. And now that I have all of my pieces, my work will be finished very, very soon. April 24th, 2014. I've done it.
I've named him Boris, an ode to one of the classics. I don't know if he'll understand, but I'm remaining hopeful. He doesn't understand much as of yet. His eyes are dull, and he can't seem to keep them open for very long. All of his movements are sluggish, to the point to where I feel the restraints are almost unnecessary. I'm hoping he will soon dispel the idea very soon, though. For the time remaining, I will continue to monitor his health and allow him to take in the environment around him. The more rigorous tests will begin soon enough. April 30th, 2014. Things are moving slowly, but in the right direction. I've begun more direct testing on Boris, and my current results are encouraging. We started today with vocal testing. I attempted to start a conversation and made none of any responses. The conversation topics were basic, simple questions about himself and his well-being. absolutely no reaction. I'll admit, things felt a little awkward with his complete strapping down to the table while I sat next to him, but that doesn't seem like an explanation for him to not so much as turn his head. I attempted louder stimuli, screaming, hurling obscenities, bashing my fists into the table, etc., and he was able to hear clearly, judging from his eyes looking towards me each time, but he refuses to respond in kind. There may be damage to his frontal lobe that I'm not aware of. Physical stimuli was a different story, however. The feather I used to gauge pleasure, Albert seemed to register with him looking at me in the face rather than at the affected area. I moved to small needles to probe and test his pain limits, but again no response. Frustration got the better of me, I'm afraid, and after almost half an hour with no reaction, I jammed a large needle into his thigh. I almost couldn't get him to stop reacting. He lurched and he screamed, his muscles thrashed against the restraints. This is what I wanted, thank God, as I had probed the lab a few weeks ago to make sure they were soundproofed, otherwise this would have attracted some very bad attention. After a moment, he finally settled down and I was able to remove the needle. I patched it with a small band-aid, but again, I'm pretty sure this will not be necessary. May 1st, 2014. And I was right. By the time I'd returned to the lab this morning, the wound had completely healed. In my wildest dreams, I would have never imagined that my formula would be so powerful. I might not have just found the cure for death, I might have also found the cure for all injury and pain. This development is rather interesting, and investigating it further will be a must. So I've proposed my regular scheduled testing in favor of something more different today. Using the heaviest sedatives I could find available, with no worries of possibly killing him, I managed to sedate Boris. Even with the straps on him, I sometimes fear of getting close. He's an absolute behemoth in size, and I doubt the resurrection did anything to make him stronger. After I felt certain he was unconscious, I took my largest needles and began digging through his nose, attempting to remove some gray matter. This was a spur-of-the-moment decision, so I'll admit as much in my work that was very clumsy at times. Blood drained from his nose like a river, and I knew I would have to burn this lab coat after today. For any other subject, this would have certainly killed them, though Boris was quite the resilient one. After I'd collected a sample, I examined it under a microscope. It was just as I had hoped for. Even with the small bit of cells that I had created and collected from him, they were full of life, containing and continuing to grow and repair themselves, even after being removed from the host body. Nothing in all of nature is that resilient. I was interrupted by my work, and I almost fell out of my chair when I heard him scream behind me. Apparently, even the highest order of sedatives weren't enough to keep him down for very long. I quickly restrained him, placing a gag on his mouth as I made after yesterday's tests. Still, he continued to struggle for over an hour afterwards, and I lost all motivation to continue working for that day. He was struggling so much, and I didn't think he understood what for. Hopefully, his cognitive abilities will continue to grow so that he might be able to understand that I'm doing all of this for the betterment of mankind. May 7th, 2014. Big news from today. Big news. This might be the single most important discovery in human history, and I bore witness to it. I'll start from the beginning. The trials I ran on Boris today centered around his sense of taste. Live experimentation as to how many nutrients I gave him feverishly, and lived up to reach the conclusion that he might not need food at all. His behavior doesn't seem to change no matter how much of a substance he is given. Despite this, I feel that taste is a good sense as to prod at, and he seemed to respond. As I prepared 3 meals for him, 1 tender steak that I took great effort to prepare, a bowl of oatmeal that I poured several spoonfuls of salt into, and 1 milkshake that I had laced with streptomycin. The test seemed to be if he could differentiate between pleasant and unpleasant tastes, as well as his body was resilient to the outside stimulants and poisons. He seemed to be able to instinctively understand that I was trying to feed him and accepted all food without fail. I almost miffed when he ate my steak without so much as a smile or grunt. Cooking is a hobby I would consider myself fairly adept at, but from his expression, he could have been eating nothing more than flavorless gristle. The oatmeal yielded a much stronger reaction. He swallowed his first bite, but grimaced as the food slid down his throat. When I fed him a second mouthful, he spit it out and would not take any more after that. So, at the very least, he understands when something is bad. He was more than accepting of the milkshake, however. I waited an hour for him to finish, and looking for any signs of poison symptoms, and got nothing. It might as well have been a regular milkshake, as my conclusion is that the cells in his body are able to act and keep the poison at bay without so much as any of the convulsions or asphyxiation that a normal human would suffer from. Whether this is a wider variety of poisons will be inducing the same result, I will have to continue to test. This was all well and good, but the important part came at the end of the day. I had successfully continued another round of testing and was eager to return home. As my hand reached for the exit, a noise from across the room stopped me. I turned to see Boris had turned his head and was now staring directly at me. Daniel. He spoke in a soft whisper. My mouth slacked and I completely forgot about returning home. I've never spoken that word to Daniel aloud in the lab, and I barely speak at all when working. Yet somehow he had learned to say this one particular thing. His name, or at least the name of the grad student who I had used, he'd remembered that name. This was beyond staggering. As I can comprehend, I've expected to breathe life into an old body, not resurrect that person wholesale. Perhaps Lazarus would have been a more appropriate name now. Whether he continues to remember things as of yet to be determined, but this is not the only significant discovery I've made today, but probably the most significant in history. May 9th, 2014. Things have developed faster than I could have anticipated. This is not just his name anymore, it's incomplete sentences. I can get the gist of what he's asking, although it's clear he's struggling to arrange his thoughts. It must be a side effect of his brain revitalizing itself, and I'll give an example. I walked into the lab today and Boris greeted me with, hello, doctor, father, scientist, I immediately thought of a child trying to figure out how to address someone they're unfamiliar with. My working theory is that all the words are there in his brain, he simply cannot figure out how to arrange them yet. He knows that I'm a scientist, and knows that the title for me would be doctor, but I also think that because I'm a male authority figure, he's also sticking the word father in as a way to hedge on his bets. It's amusing to see him do this. In another instance, I heard him speak. Daniel, hurt, let go, This was an obvious plea for me to release his straps, something I wouldn't be doing for a good long while. It tells me that he's feeling pain and that he understands the concept of asking for help, but he hasn't recognized when and where it is effective. Perhaps this will come in time. He insists on going by his real name, which I routinely reject. I understand his desire, but I think it will be unwise to switch to that name. He is not Daniel anymore, and he never will be. I'm hoping in time he'll understand. Unfortunately, Boris' climb back into sentience would not come at a worse time. For today, I had a series of physical exams well planned out, and he was obviously going to be fully aware of them. I considered a sedative, but that would defeat the purpose of the tests. And besides, judging from his reactions to earlier, I don't think it would be effective. I began with the tickle test as I had before. This time his eyes followed mine more closely, and he repeated several words such as, father, I cannot feel, and I stop. I cringed, knowing what was to come. After I finished with the feather, I moved on to a small sewing needle. Again, he didn't seem to feel anything, although his eyes continued to follow mine as I poked and prodded. The same result as the last test. When it came time for the real testing, I decided to gag him. This would make it easier for me, not hearing his screams and sobs. He resisted the gag, of course, as his head twitched and bobbed while he cried to beg in his own fractured way. A display of sad as it was ineffective. After fastening the gag, I moved to grab the large needle from the supply closet, and I saw at Boris' eyes when they're widened to their fullest. He began to thrash and struggle, but restraints held firm. I had all but stabbed all of his most sensitive areas: torso, abdomen, arms, legs, groin, etc. I couldn't bring myself to do his face, though. Judging from his other reactions, I'm sure it would have just been the same result. He wept and screamed through the whole ordeal, trying desperately to get away. I apologized consistently as I worked, but I'm not even sure he heard, much less understood. There's no way he can comprehend how difficult this was for me. I'm not a violent man, and I don't enjoy doing this. It simply must be done, and I'm only the person who can do it. One interesting thing did occur after I removed his gag, though I'm not exactly sure what he meant, but he said something to the effect of, "I please, no more. Daniel hurt. Scientists hurt. Again, no. If again, then hurt I." Now, the gist of this is pretty obvious: no more tests. I initially took it as a pleading that his brain was unable to coherently process and interpret. Though writing it down, however, another thought crossed my mind. What if this wasn't a plea? What if it was a threat? May 13th, 2014. I now know that I have become death, destroyer of worlds, I. This was the quote Oppenheimer took from the Holy Scriptures to describe his feelings after the Trinity nuclear tests. The overwhelming feeling of dread that one feels after they've unleashed something dangerous into the world that they can no longer control. The helplessness, the guilt, the fear. People will die, and that blood will be spilled on their hands. It is also encompassing a feeling of despair that I cannot fathom into words that will be able to convey. Boris has escaped.
May 19th, 2014. I haven't been sleeping well. Last night I got maybe 3 hours, and that's been my best all week. I don't know how much longer I can sustain this. My body is constantly exhausted, yet my mind still won't rest. My hunt for Boris has been fruitless. Every possible avenue I could think of has turned out to be a dead end. I investigated all of Daniel's previous friends and family, but from my current observations, it looks as though he hasn't tried contacting them. This also applies to the staff here at the university. They all seem to be continuing life as though nothing has happened. I can't tell if this is a good or a bad omen. There is one bit of news that I've heard that's piqued my curiosity. 2 days ago, an ambulance was called in response to a large naked man seen stumbling in an alley and bleeding heavily. The EMTs dragged him into the car and began patching his wounds when the man suddenly became extremely violent and attacked them. They were unable to restrain him. Eventually, he caused enough chaos to crash the ambulance into a tree off the side of the road. The driver survived, while the other EMT died almost instantly. No other bodies were found. The driver gave an interview while recovering in the hospital, where he described the man as enormous, powerful, and crazed. He stated that he wasn't even sure if they had picked up a real person. I'll be damned if this was anybody besides Boris. May 22nd, 2014. For posterity's sake, I keep a recording device on at all times while I'm in the lab. This is to ensure that any flash of verbal brilliance I might experience during the day isn't lost because I didn't have time to pause and write something down. I've used this recording a few times during my research, but it has never been more necessary than it was today. I worked late, trying to find any leads that I could on Boris. During this, I inevitably had to use the bathroom. This took maybe 3 minutes in total. When I returned, Boris was standing in the center of my lab, wearing a set of dirty clothes and holding the needle I had brought in with all those weeks ago. The rest of this entry will be a transcript of this encounter. Jesus, fuck. How? Good evening, Doctor. You seem well. No need for such theatrics. Boris, how? How did you get in here? I got out, didn't I? It should follow then that I would be able to get back in. Your language. What are you doing here? Why did you come back? You still seem so afraid, Doctor. Why is that? You didn't seem so afraid when we saw each other last. Has something changed?
At this point, he has put the needle down, but is approaching me slowly, clearly an attempt at intimidation. You know, where have you been? Have people seen you? Do they know?
I've been in hiding mostly, trying to answer questions for myself. I've actually got one for you. Was my name Daniel at one point?
I stared at him blankly, before simply nodding in affirmation.
I knew it. There's not many memories left to me, and I'll be damned if I understand any of them. But I knew that had to be my name.
Boris, please.
Daniel. My name is Daniel. I'm not your creation. I had a life before you. Even if there's only a few, I still have memories from then. A funeral from my childhood, where a woman much too young laid in the casket. I've come to assume this must have been my mother. Another one I have is from a few short years ago, as I lay naked on top of a woman in the backseat of an old car. We're both sweating and avoiding eye contact, so I can only assume that this was me losing my virginity. In my most recent memory, I'm alone, however. Sitting silently in a hospital bed, waiting for something. I'm not sure what. I remember other things too, of course. Language, basic facts about the world, names of people and places. Even if I'm not sure exactly to whom or what they belong. But it's these flashes of my previous life that stick out the most. They're so visceral and intense, yet still distant. I know I experienced them, but I almost have a hard time feeling it, if that makes any sense. They prove that I lived a life, even if I can't remember all of it. These memories, these reminders of my past life, have been all that have kept me sane through this unending hell you've ushered me into. Every moment I'm conscious in this body is screaming agony, both physically and mentally. My mind wishes for rest, but I cannot sleep. My muscles want to relax, but they are always flexing and moving. My nerves are constantly firing, making sure I'm aware of every bit of excruciating pain your work is inflicting on my makeshift form. These aren't my arms or my legs or torso. They feel nothing like the ones from my memories. They're a prison you've constructed for me. You didn't save me from death. You condemn me to hell. There is a moment of silence as Boris finishes speaking. What do you want? What do I want? I want to die. Again, a moment of silence reigns over the room. Excuse me? Do you believe I'm human? What? Do you believe I'm human? Yes, of course. That was the whole point. To bring back a person. So, you thought I was a human when you desecrated my corpse. You thought I was a human as you stitched me together with the bodies of others you also thought were human. You thought I was a human as you poked and prodded at me. as you kept me strapped to a table for weeks on end, as you tore at my flesh with your needle, as you filled my stomach with poison. You thought I was human, yet still did all of this. Of course I did. I mean, I knew what needed to be done. The sacrifices required so that countless more could continue living. I carried that burden. You carried nothing. All of the burden was mine, and mine alone. You think I'm human? Yes. Then treat me like one, for the first time. Allow me to return to death with dignity. I categorically refuse. There is another pause here, while he seems to compose himself. I misphrased this. You will kill me. It is not a request. I cannot and will not. You are the most valuable discovery mankind has ever made, and I refuse to condemn everyone else to the Stone Age to satisfy your own comforts. All your research has done so far is producing suffering in every form. You're a disgusting, pitiful man, and if I had any other recourse, I would not be here. However, all of my suicide attempts up until this point have proven to be abject failures. Whatever you've done to me, it's made me impervious. No matter how much I stabbed and ripped at myself, my body refused to remain damaged, rebuilding itself and regenerating before I could fully pass. The ambulance. So, you've read the news. They found me as I was tearing open my insides, trying to remove my organs. I'd lost a lot of blood and was too tired to resist them initially. Once I was in the ambulance, however, my body had mostly regenerated. I tried to get them to stop, but they kept jabbing at me, and I remembered this lab and I just... Don't concern yourself with this. Sacrifices have to be made if we ever want to. Don't excuse my actions like you would your own. What I did is unforgivable, and I know there is no way to properly atone. I am here to end my own suffering and nothing more. So I will repeat myself. Give me a way to end my own life. I will not throw away all of my work on the whims of one man. This is not a whim. This is a threat. You will give me a way to die, or I will give you one. I'm faster than you, stronger than you, and near as I can tell, impervious to death. I will torture you as you did me for all those weeks. Your suffering will drag on as long as I see fit. I'll deprive you of food, water, and sleep. I'll flay the skin from your body. I'll rip off your appendages one by one. And every day, I will destroy another piece of your research so that no one may inflict the same fate you've inflicted on me. Another moment of silence encompasses the room. I cannot. Even if I wanted to, I wouldn't even be sure how. This body I've constructed, it's a perfect creation. You are Achilles without a heel. Boris seems contemplative for a moment, before reaching for the light switch of the lab. You have 2 weeks. I'll return for you then. Without another word, he flicked the switch, plunging us both into total darkness. I heard a series of impossibly fast footsteps, and the sound of hinges whining before I eventually found the light switch again. Boris was long gone, leaving me with his ultimatum: die or destroy my life's work. I'm too tired to contemplate this at the moment. May 28, 2014. I paused to write these words, fearing I'm not the only one with access to my journal at this point. Boris, or his phantom, stalk my every movement. When I'm in the lab, when I'm at home, when I'm driving in between, I can see him out of the corner of my eye. He'll disappear the second I attempt to focus on him, but he's there. I know it. I've moved my journal and notebooks to a secure safe that only I know the ever-changing combination to. Boris has almost certainly been in my house, rummaging through my belongings, looking for any hint as to how to kill himself, but I won't allow it. He's too precious to his world, even if he fails to realize it. In order to protect him from himself, I've devised a formula that, if injected into his bloodstream, will work with his reanimation fluid to atrophy his muscles. It's a gamble, but if it works, then he should be pacified from harming me while remaining viable as a test subject. He'd actually improve as a subject, much less prone to violence or resistance. This is the only possible option I have left. This constant threat looming over my head has inhibited my work, however. I failed to sleep a full night, and Lord knows how long. And I've noticed I can go over a day without realizing I need to eat. My eyelids are heavy, my muscles weak, and my mind dull. It's ironic in a way. Boris, using fear to have my body shut down. It'll be all the more poetic once I've turned the tables on him. June 1st, 2014. The serum is complete. Now, we wait. June 5th, 2014. I am in my lab now, waiting for Boris's arrival. I've stocked up on the serum and prepared to deliver it. I've had a thought, however. I don't think Boris intends to let me live. I mean, I can't imagine why he would, from the hatred in his voice when he spoke to me. I believe he'll try to kill me the second I reveal the serum to him. I'll simply have to be quicker. If I don't make it, I'll have hidden this notebook along with my lab notes. If you're reading this, please, I beg you, continue my work. Don't allow my hubris to be the end of this. Humanity deserves my gift, and I believe I hear him now. Goodbye. That's the last entry. Normally I would assume the story had ended there, but I did some digging and uncovered some older copies of the campus newspaper. I won't publish the full things, as they contain way too much identifying information for my institution, but I can give you guys the gist. The first is an article detailing a break-in on campus. It says the window to a lab was smashed, and the lab itself had been ripped apart. The police were tight-lipped about the motive, although nothing seemed to be stolen. What made this so mysterious, however, is that Eric Clark, the postdoc who ran the lab, had also gone missing the same night. No one had seen any sign of him in several days, up until the second article, explaining how Clark's corpse had to be fished out of a river about 10 miles south of campus. No official cause of death, although there was some speculation about suicide. They interviewed several of his colleagues and got the same response. Nice enough guy, but very reserved. Never would have expected something like this to happen. He was just some guy doing boring research on cell growth rates. Absolutely no reason for any of this. I don't want to speculate. It actually makes me nauseous whenever I think about it, but this cannot be coincidence, can it? Maybe I'll never know for sure. What I do know is this. When I was walking home from a bar last night, I spotted a large man walking behind a crowd. His face was hidden, but he stood out amongst everyone else around. A tall, dark, foreboding figure in ratty clothes. The thought of the journal creeped into my head. It couldn't be, could it? Against all of my better judgment, I moved to follow, but was pushed back by a large group of people coming my way. As I watched from the distance, I saw the figure walk away, lost in the darkness and distance.
My name is Mandy, and this story takes place when I was 10 years old, back in 1996. Me and my 8-year-old cousin, Brandon, were spending the day with my grandmother. She had let us play at the park for several hours to release some of the pent-up energy most kids have, and we weren't any different. We made a fuss about leaving, as we always did, but soon forgot about that after, enjoying the cool air conditioning inside the car, as it was the middle of the summer and sweltering outside. My grandmother promised to make us some root beer floats when we got home, but we had to make a quick stop so that she could pick up her prescriptions first. I was okay with this, because her being a diabetic for years caused trips to the local pharmacy to become a regular thing in our family. The pickup counter was located in the back of the store, and there was a small sitting area to the right where people could wait. Along the wall next to that sat several chairs, as well as health-related magazines on an end table. The most exciting part about this area, for my young, restless mind at the time, was a bin of random toys and games they'd have there for kids. I made a beeline for the bin to see if anything new or fun had been added. As I rifled through the contents of the bright red bin, oblivious to the rest of my surroundings, I felt Brandon beside me. He yanked the sleeve of my shirt slightly, as if to get my attention, as he whispered, "Mandy." I huffed slightly and asked what he wanted. He suddenly extended his pointer finger out in front of himself, and my eyes followed its direction. They landed on a middle-aged man sitting in one of the chairs. I gasped a little as I was surprised to see him there, as I had been too preoccupied earlier to notice. I observed him a moment. He was wearing leather loafers, khaki slacks, and a white polo shirt. His graying hair was clean-cut, so nothing about his appearance screamed out of the ordinary. His eyes were closed and he appeared to be napping, as he was what I assumed waiting on his medicine. I quickly shrugged him off as he wasn't bothering us, and I began digging back through the toy bin. Not a minute went by before I felt Brandon pulling on my sleeve again, this time more roughly. I was starting to lose my patience at this point, so I snapped my head around to face him and shouted, "What?" He pointed towards the man again and quietly stated, "He's playing statue." I furrowed my brows a moment as I took in what he was saying. Playing statue was a game we'd play, where we'd randomly stand someplace completely still and pretend to be a statue. You know, silly kids' games. I scoffed in mock disbelief as I told him, "Brandon, stop lying." However, when I scanned Brandon's face for a hint that he may be messing around, there was none. He was still pointing, and he had a half-confused look on his face. I finally turned to acknowledge the man, and sure enough, Brandon was telling the truth. My breath caught in my throat as I saw the man sitting with his legs crossed, one over the other, his elbow raised on top of his knee as he half-cradled his face just under his chin. The most terrifying and odd thing about this was the smile he adorned. His eyes were wide, staring straight at us both, as the most manic, Joker-like grin was plastered on his face. My mouth fell open a bit, but no sound came out. My brain was still trying to process the weird sight mere feet away. I broke from my daze as I heard Brandon make a noise of discomfort as he muttered, "I don't like the way he plays, Mandy." I felt him scoot behind me as if to hide. In the few seconds I turned my attention on Brandon to tell him it will be okay, the man went back to his original state of laying back with his eyes closed and his head tilted back. Being naturally creeped out, I grabbed Brandon by his small hand and we marched over to where my grandma was at the counter, speaking to the pharmacist. With the waiting area still in sight from the counter, I chanced a gander back towards the man, and to my complete horror, he was back in the previous smiling position. However, this time, he had moved to the chair nearest to the counter, nearest to us. I heard Brandon sniffle as he buried his face in the back of my shirt. As frightening as it was, I couldn't tear my blue eyes away from the man out of fear of what he'd do next when I wasn't looking. Luckily, my grandma paid for her prescription and we started to exit. The entire time on the way out, the man never moved from a psychotic statue-like state. The thing that bothers me most about the whole ordeal, even to this day, is that I don't know if he was just messing around with us, or if he was actually insane. I may never know. This may not seem that scary of a tale to some, and that's fine. The oddness of his behavior creeped us out, not to mention the fact that just a week earlier, a 7-year-old girl named Morgan Violi was abducted from our town in broad daylight. I'm thankful that man never actually tried to grab or take us, but whenever I see a clown, mime, or anything with a wide smile, an unsettling feeling chills me to the bone.
Life After Death, written by the third person. At first, I didn't know what was happening. I was staring at a high, arched ceiling while quiet music played. I tried to sit up, but couldn't. I opened my mouth to call out, but couldn't do that either. I couldn't even blink. Sleep paralysis, I thought. I'd never experienced this before, but I'd read about it. Waking up before your body does, trapped and unable to move. I'd read that it often came accompanied by terror and dread, by dreams of demons coming to squat on your chest, but none of that happened to me. I just stared upward, endlessly listening to the soft sounds of a crowd shuffling into position somewhere nearby. There were hushed conversations, but nothing I could clearly make out. There were footsteps then, and my father passed briefly by my field of vision. He was wearing a suit, and I suddenly realized I was staring at a church ceiling. I started to panic even. A feeling which only intensified when my father began speaking. We are gathered here today to mourn the passing of my son. No! I shouted, but no sound came out. This is wrong. I'm here, I yelled, I flailed, I screamed and kicked, all to no avail. My body remained utterly still, my eyes still staring endlessly upward. I begged anything that was listening to help me. I pleaded and threatened by turns, but still my father spoke on, his voice heavy with emotion. He stopped several times to compose himself, struggling to come to terms with the loss of his son. I'm not lost. I tried to tell him. I willed him to read my mind. I'm here. Something's wrong. Don't do this. Other people took the podium and spoke, and I heard of my accomplishments, of the fond memories I'd inspired. People spoke of my wit, my friendship, and potential, and through it all, I screamed soundlessly. Eventually, the speeches stopped, and I heard a rustling as the crowd rose from its seats. My father came into view again, holding my mother as she cried, his arms around her. They looked down at me, and I struggled desperately to blink, to twitch, to move. My eyes the merest fraction, anything to show them that I was alive. Daryl, said my mother in an uneven whisper. For a moment, I thought it had worked, that she'd seen something. Daryl, why are his eyes open? My father reached out and gently slid the lids of my eyes closed. Internally, I shrieked at him. Notice the temperature of my skin, feel my breath, anything. But after a moment, his hand withdrew, and I heard them walk away. Others came, a procession of mourners traipsing past my coffin. I heard tears, whispered regrets, apologies, and farewells. Several times I felt a hand touch my cheek, but no one seemed to notice I was still there, trapped inside. The grayness I could see abruptly deepened to black, and I heard a lid close. I was jostled from side to side, unable to brace myself even the slightest amount as the coffin was lifted. I felt every step the pallbearers took, felt the solid thunk onto the metal rails as they loaded me into the back of the hearse. mentally mapped every turn in the road as it carried me to the cemetery. I calmed myself during this process, focusing on storing up my energy as they carried my coffin to the graveyard and set it down again. If I could manage one twitch of my foot, my hand, even my head, I could hit the side of the coffin and let them all know. The priest droned through a prayer, and I waited until the very end before focusing all my might on a single movement. One noise to save my life. Nothing. I produced not even a rustle on the fabric lining of the coffin. Despondent, I felt the winch begin to lower me into the grave, then heard a thick, pattering clump as the priest threw a ceremonial handful of dirt on top. I screamed again. Silently, of course. I wept inside my own head, thrashed and prayed and begged until I heard the solid, definitive sound of a cascade of dirt being pushed over my coffin by a backhoe. The sound rang in my ears, quickly grew muffled, and then went silent. I was left alone in the dark, nothing but the terrified thoughts in my head for company. Silent and still, I waited for death by suffocation to take me. I woke up in my bed at home, confused and relieved. I checked my pulse, fogged a mirror with my breath. I was still very much alive and intensely relieved to be so. I ran outside in my boxers just to breathe deeply and smell the air. It was invigorating. The dream stuck with me though. Every sensation, every desperate thought of escape, every nice sentiment said about me at the funeral, even. It all stayed crystal clear, refusing to fade as dreams usually do. All through the day, I kept coming back to it, kept thinking about it. It all felt so completely real. When I fell asleep that night, I dreamed of darkness. Images of floating in space flashed through my mind before I realized the awful truth. I was back underground, back in my coffin, just as on the previous night I was frozen in place. My head rolled to the side while the coffin was being moved around, and I had one ear pressed to the bottom of it. With the dirt having settled from the previous day, the insects and animals that lived underground were returning, and I could hear them softly moving by, investigating the strange new solid object that had been lowered into their domain. Things rustled and scraped, but not ominously. It grew peaceful after a while, an odd sort of white noise, and I lay there and listened and let it gently lull me. I woke up before the sun rose and found myself in my bed again. The confusion was still with me, but the relief I'd felt the previous day was slipping. I climbed out of bed and showered, but the rushing of the water made me think of the rustling of the insects, and I hurried to get out again. All day I thought I could feel the sensation of fabric pressing against my left cheek, a light touch that vanished when I tried to focus on it. That night I dreamed of the coffin again, the rustling, the quiet noises of the subterranean life around me. It's been like that every night since, and I can feel my body drawing in on itself now when I dream. I'm shrinking, shriveling, and decaying. Last night, something was beginning to scratch, so I know my decay is felt outside too. I suspect I'll be able to feel the bugs on me soon, and in me. I wonder if it will hurt. I'm sleeping less and less each night. It's been less than 2 weeks, but I'm already down to less than 4 hours a night. I wake up refreshed, and the time in the coffin no longer terrifies me. The thing I've been wondering lately, though, is, am I sleeping less and less, spending less time dreaming of my coffin, or am I sleeping more and more, dreaming that I'm still alive?
Either way, this ends tomorrow. Written by Drac MCV. I can't take it anymore. Tina ground through her clenched teeth. She pushed herself up from the chair and stomped her way towards the front door. No! I really tried to stop her, but her actions caught me by surprise. I'm tired of being a prisoner. Her last words will be forever etched into my subconscious. She threw the door open, just outside my reaching hands. I leapt for her, but stopped myself against the door jab before crossing the threshold. For as much as I loved my wife, I couldn't force myself to chase after her. I called her name, begging her to come back inside. However, my pleas were useless, because I knew that the moment her feet landed in the yard, it was too late. I felt like a coward for not stomping out then grabbing her, but I'd seen this before with many of our neighbors, and the outcome was always the same. No one was ever successful at playing the hero. Panicked, I looked up and down the street, silently screaming for help that I knew would not arrive. From my periphery, I noticed a quick succession of blinds and curtains closing quickly in the houses on our street. I was on my own. More specifically, Tina was on her own, and I was just a pitiful lump, frozen by fear and forced to watch. Tina sprinted in the direction of where our car was parked in the end of the street. The ignition key in her hand was at the ready, and for a moment, I truly believed that she was going to make it. She barely made it to the end of the yard where it meets the street curb before they caught her. I didn't even see them coming, and given that Tina made no change in her course to avoid the attack, neither did she. Nobody ever sees them coming. They're just there, and upon their unlucky victim in a blink. They swarmed her, almost blocking her from my sight completely. Like a blur, their wretched fingers turned her clothes to shreds that flew chaotically from inside the swarm like party streamers. Her skin wouldn't be as lucky. They peeled it away from her body like a flesh banana, flagrantly tossing the bloody strips into the air, making sure that I, nay, the entire neighborhood was watching. She never stood a chance against them and suffered a slow, agonizing death by their hands. As instantly as they appeared, they were out of sight before her body hit the ground. Even if I wanted to, I couldn't even risk going out there to clean up the mess. Tina was the third person this month that tried to escape, but she ultimately ended up the same way as the ones before her. I assumed it was hunger, compelled with madness caused by cabin fever that drove them to risk brutal death for freedom. They run this town. No matter how much anyone refuses to believe it, it is a fact. Their origin is a complete mystery, as no one has ever communicated with them successfully. But even if they were to find out, I don't think it would matter. We can't defeat them, we can't outsmart them, we can't escape them. By the time you realize that one of them is standing in front of you, there will be 10 or more. The police is no longer responding to our calls, or any first responder for that matter. The festering corpse of Bridget, my elderly neighbor from 2 houses up, is still slumped in the middle of the main street. She made the mistake of trying to reason with them, and they made a fine example of her. There is no reasoning with them. They delight in the pain they inflict. They relish in our tears. I can hear it in the growls and gnashing, and it reflects in the glint of their black, soulless eyes. But there's a plan in place. I mean, I'm dead anyway, right? With all the power they have over us, they never caught on to the way we, the prisoners, have learned to communicate without leaving our houses. I volunteered to be the bait. At sunrise tomorrow, I'm going to stand in the middle of my yard, and when they rush me, the entire neighborhood will open fire on them to the fullest, deadliest extent of our collective arsenal. If that doesn't work, we'll all be dead. It'd be better to go down fighting. I don't care anymore. I can't take another second of this torture. Tomorrow, when the bullets fly, I will finally be free of this hell, and all the children will finally be dead. Hopefully. This has been Either Way, This Ends Tomorrow, written by Drac MCV, and narrated by Onyx The Mad Man.
Whimper, written by Mythology Loves Horror. The shovel stopped mid-dig, a metallic thunk announcing that it had struck something other than dirt. Ramona jabbed into the soil again, curious about what was buried in her newly bought backyard. Her brow crinkled in annoyance at how poorly her plan to plant a wisteria tree was going, but the prospect of buried treasure quickly ignited a childlike excitement in her. She had bought the countryside house in Waitsfield, Vermont, at a highly discounted price, one that her real estate agent Dave frequently joked was almost too good to be true. This house is simply to die for, and the price guarantees that you won't be crushed by debt. He had promised to be close by if she needed anything, and told her that if she ever wanted someone to show her around the area, she could give him a call. Dave had been flirting unashamedly with her since he had shown her around the property the week before, so Ramona has been glad to sign the paperwork and escape from his cramped, dingy office. While she was there, he hadn't mentioned the previous owners burying a time capsule or anything of the sort, so this was probably a forgotten child's toy or a long-lost metal lunchbox. A few minutes worth of rapid digging passed, and more metal was revealed. 3 hours later, Ramona stood, filthy and panting, in front of a once-buried door that led further down into the depths of her backyard. She had expected a palm-sized object to be unearthed, not something that belongs on the side of a house. The dirt-streaked, iron door was chained closed, with bolts and padlocks festooning it. As she was staring at it, she could swear that she heard something move behind it, and an almost inaudible scraping sound reached her ears. Ramona shook her head, easily convincing herself that she was just exhausted, and that it must be dirt sliding around on the other side of the door from her disturbing the soil. The amount of rust on the chains showed that it had been closed for a long time, and when she tugged at one of the padlocks, it stayed firmly in place. She would ask Dave about it in the morning. At that moment, her growling stomach loudly demanded attention, so she figured that the mystery of the door could hold off until tomorrow. A phone call and a hot shower later found Ramona on the couch, a box of delivery pizza in hand. She clicked around Netflix, finally ending up in the horror section. "What should we watch, Frankie boy?" Her black lab Frank wagged his tail at her, clearly only interested in getting pizza. She tossed him one, laughing as her greedy mutt expertly caught the slice by the crust. He wolfed it down, barking happily in thanks. Ramona flicked past Let Me In, King Kong, Nightmare on Elm Street, and Friday the 13th, before settling on The Mummy. She hadn't seen the newest one yet, and the way the strange door in her backyard reminded her of a tomb had her in the mood for something scary. Ramona and Frank finished the movie, and as she headed to bed, she found herself feeling a little nervous at her first night alone in the Vermont countryside. She had grown up in Philadelphia, so being able to see trees outside of her window was a novelty. The house was also full of odd creaks, which Dave had assured her was just the house settling. The wind was knocking a few of the old-fashioned shutters against the side of the house, so she made sure to latch them in place before going to bed. There was no use in scaring herself silly over a window. Around 4 a.m., a deep growl woke her, and she took a moment to process what was happening. Frank was out of the bed, something her lazy mutt hated doing at night, and he was staring at the far window. Ramona could tell that it was the one overlooking the backyard, and the sight of her normally placid dog's raised hackles was a bit disturbing. "Frank, come." When he ignored her, Ramona got out of bed, her slipperless feet wincing away from the cold hardwood floor. She grit her teeth and made her way to the dog, gently tugging at his collar to get his attention. In the moonlight, she saw his eyes shift over to her, but he wouldn't budge. He was clearly guarding the bed and wasn't about to leave his post. "Damn it, Frankie. Get in the bed." No response. Not even a tail wag. Ramona let go of his collar, making her way gingerly over to the window closest to her bed. She was sure that all he was freaking out about was something new to him, like a deer or maybe a coyote. Just to be safe, she pressed her hand to the glass and peered around the yard, her eyes straining to make anything out in the darkness of the cloudy country night. She checked the first 2 windows, each with the same result. There was nothing moving out there, not even so much as a leaf blowing across the grass outside. She let out a frustrated sigh, her annoyance level spiking with each window that proved that there wasn't anything her dog should be upset over. By then her feet were freezing, and getting in bed was more tempting than checking the last of the 4 windows. The moment she turned to go back to bed was when the harsh ringing sound of heavy chains heaping together caused her to jump and shriek. Ramona ran to the final window, her eyes growing wide at the sight of the now open doorway. This was when Frank decided to run out of the room howling, his paws skidding on the wooden floor as he pelted down the stairs and out the doggy door. Ramona ran after him, barely stopping long enough to grab a flashlight out of a kitchen drawer. She threw open her front door, darting into the yard after her best friend. Her shrill pleas for Frank to come back went unheeded, and just as she rounded the corner of the house closest to the buried door, she saw something move in it, then disappear. She skidded to a halt at the maw of the door, her hands shaking so badly that the flashlight beam was bouncing. Ramona could hear Frank moving further and further away, and in a moment the sound was smothered by the musty air wafting out of the doorway. All she wanted to do was call the police, but she didn't want to get in trouble for wasting their time. Plus, with how far out in the country she lived, Frank could have gotten hurt by the time they would make it there. She would just have to rescue him herself. As she stood there debating, her knees trembling in terror, she heard her dog's quiet whimper. "Frank!" Her cry was swallowed by the darkness, and all that followed was silence. That was the first time she noticed the deep furrows on the inner side of the door. There were large, thick gouges in the iron, something which no animal could have done. They were long and unbroken, crossing from the upper right corner to the bottom left side as though angrily swiped onto the door. Ramona was shaken out of her observance by another whimper, this one sounding even more shrill and panicked. That was it. She knew she couldn't just stand there while Frank was in trouble, so she repressed her fear of the unknown and passed through the doorway. The first step was hardly illuminated by the flashlight, and staring ahead was like looking down a bottomless well. For just a moment, she thought she saw the glint of eyes in the darkness, but they were gone before she could see more. The railless steps wound downwards in a spiral, and it took all of Ramona's concentration to not fall.
The stairs were spotted with slick, dark patches of liquid, and once she realized it was blood, she broke down sobbing. Something had gotten Frank, but she still had to know what happened. As she reached the bottom of the staircase, she found a pile of eviscerated rats, their mutilated corpses strewn about the narrow hallway. Her relief that it wasn't Frank's blood was quickly replaced with horror as the dead bodies trailed off into the darkness. The decapitated heads of the rodents spaced like macabre paving stones. Ramona resisted the urge to vomit at both the grisly sight and the noxious stench, and as she made her way down the rock-walled corridor, she was careful not to step on any of the poor creatures. The corridor, barely lit in the weak beam of her flashlight, was just damp, solid rock wall. The floor was some sort of semi-rotted wood, and it looked like it could have once have been an old root cellar. At the end of this hallway lay a second metal door, but this one had been smashed through. It was ripped off its hinges and had several gouges along its surface.
Frank?
She hadn't heard any noise, except for her own footsteps, but fear was nearly winning the battle for Ramona's fight or flight response. The entire situation was surreal, and she just wanted to get Frank and pretend that the whole creepy experience had never happened. As she stepped gingerly around the last rat carcass, something caught her eye in the next room, her flashlight barely causing it to glint. For a hopeful heartbeat, she thought it might have been Frank's collar, but as she passed through the second doorway, Ramona saw that the beam was reflecting off of a massive golden statue. The ceiling-tall cobra was melded around a hieroglyph-covered pillars, layers of sand blanketing the base of the serpent. For a moment, Ramona wondered if she was even in Pennsylvania any longer, or if this was some sort of outlandish nightmare. The statue had two arms with long, dagger-like claws protruding from each scaled limb, and it had an almost human-like intelligence emblazoned on its face. While fascinating, it wasn't her dog. She began scanning the room for any signs of Frank, but there was nothing other than more sand. She was sure that there hadn't been any other hallways branching off, and she didn't remember seeing any other doors. After the stairs, it had been a straight shot to the snake room, and there hadn't been anywhere for a 60-pound lab to hide. Ramona was becoming frantic, her chest constricting as her panic built. The thought that monsters existed was almost too much to process. There had to be a rational explanation for everything that had happened, and she was probably becoming terrified over nothing. Even as Ramona tried to shake the clawing, dark thoughts from her head, they crept right back in. Something had taken the chains off the outer door. Something had very recently decapitated a bunch of rats. Something was strong enough to leave marks in the reinforced iron door. And something must have a dog. She had to find him.
Frank, come here, boy. Now! Where's my good boy? Frank!
Silence was all that answered her call. Tears began rolling down her cheeks, and Ramona held back a sob. The sound of slow applause made her scream. Well, congratulations, Miss Gabourey. You made it further than any of the others. My demon must really like you if you didn't immediately end up like the rats, since he has a tendency to play with his food before eating it.
He?
Oh yes. Let me introduce you to my pet. His name is Naja, and he's about 1,000 years old, hence his horrendously outdated taste and decor.
Why do you have a demon? How do you have a demon? This is great.
Ramona stopped in mid-sentence as the sand at the base of the effigy began to undulate, the ripple spreading outwards until the statue's tail was slithering across the ground. The beast began unwinding itself from the pillar, and where Ramona expected a metallic, grating noise, there was only the soft shifting of the sand. She turned her attention to Dave, tensing her body to sprint past him. Just as she was about to dart forward, the creature's tail lashed out, knocking her off her feet. Before Ramona could catch her breath, she was slammed down, 8 massive, golden claws caging her torso to the ground. She screamed again, a long, wailing sound that echoed around the chamber. Tears were streaming freely now, making trails in the sand and dust that had settled across her cheeks. Oh, don't look so sad, Ramona. Your life has finally some actual meaning now, and your pathetic little existence will help fuel a new era in world history. When he's eaten enough, this bad boy will be able to break free of here, and once that happens, he'll be unstoppable, and I, as his master, will of course reap the benefits. The demonic entity began pinching his claws together, effectively squeezing the air from Ramona's lungs. She tried to scream again, but it came out as more of a gurgled cough. Between his natural armor and deadly appendages, Naja will bring back the glory days of the old gods. Besides, why keep killing off all the redneck Vermont house buyers for mere pennies when I could make billions killing off the world? Frank was crouched under the porch in the backyard, his tail tucked between his legs. He had tried to warn his human that the suit man was outside in the dark, but she had ignored him and told him to get into bed. He had led her downstairs to show her, but for some reason, she had run right past him and gone down the bad-smelling stairs that were in the grass. His whimpers hadn't reached her, and each time she had called to him, he had wanted to go to her, but his fear was too great. Couldn't she hear the bad thing moving in the dark? Why hadn't his friend come back yet? His soft cries continued long into the night as his heart filled with sadness, and he just wanted his human back.
Claire hurried home from the market. The weather had suddenly turned unexpectedly while she was shopping, and she was determined not to get her new doll wet. Claire had collected China dolls since she was a kid, and the recent addition to her collection just so happens to be a very rare and very collectible doll named Annie. She couldn't believe she finally had an Annie doll, and was equally blown away by how little money the previous owner had taken for the doll. But this was no concern to Claire. Everything suggested this was a genuine Annie doll, and finally, it was hers. Claire spent the evening cleaning Annie up before finally posing her on a stand with the other dolls. It had been a long day, so Claire decided to get an early night and headed upstairs to bed. But Claire wasn't asleep for long before she heard a loud thud, followed by a voice.
Annie's on the first step.
Claire's whole body went cold as she heard it again.
Annie's on the second step.
Claire was terrified, but convinced she was hearing things, she opened her bedroom door and peered down the stairs. empty. It must have been some kind of dream, Claire thought to herself, as she climbed back into bed. A short while later, it started again, only this time Claire was fast asleep.
Annie's on the first step. Annie's on the second step. Annie's on the third step.
On it went, while Claire slept soundly.
Annie's on the top step. Annie's on the landing. Annie's at your door. Annie's in the bedroom.
Claire stirred slowly, having felt what she thought was something on the bed. She sat up and was immediately paralysed with fear. The last words she heard were,
Annie's gonna kill you.
Three shots of whiskey apparently isn't enough to keep me asleep anymore. I don't know what the fuck is happening. I can't even close my eyes more than a few seconds without hearing it. That crying. I was looking right at him. I know it was him. It was Hector. Back in the early 2018s, I was working at a heating air company called L&R Comfort in Central California. I worked with a small team of HVAC techs installing ductwork in crawl spaces and attics, mostly upscale residential areas. It was a dirty, exhausting job since I was climbing around in these tight spaces, but I didn't mind it. I had good benefits and brought home a decent check every week. However, I left L&R Comfort a few months back. I couldn't keep going back into work after what happened. It was about 4 months ago, and we were doing a duct replacement on a massive old Victorian home, right smack dab in the middle of wine country. I was partnered up with one guy named Hector, and the system was underneath the house. We spent all day tearing out the old ductwork through the teeny accessway on the side of the house. It was killing our backs and was overall very uncomfortable. We kept taking smoke breaks out front by our truck in between the stints of crawling under the house, cutting off pieces of duct and maneuvering it back out. We did all this while army crawling around under there. It was about 3 p.m. We took our half-hour lunch break. At 3:20, Hector went inside to use the client's restroom while I finished up my burrito. We were almost done with the removal process, and all I could think about was going home and taking a shower. I heard Hector flush the toilet from the window, so I snapped my headlamp back and went around to the access. All we had left to remove was a few smaller pieces that were all the way across the house from the access point, and I knew this was going to be the hardest part. I made my way slowly under and across the house and realized Hector was already under there working on it. He was the type of worker that never stopped working so that he could go home early and drink a beer, so it didn't really surprise me. He was cutting the last of the ductwork off the boot and told me not to come all the way so he could just pass the pieces to me and I could drag them out. So I waited him to finish cutting and I just laid on my back to stretch out for a minute. I remember just laying there, kind of daydreaming about going home when I heard Hector start to cry. It was very quiet, and I wasn't completely sure that was what I was hearing or not. I shouted out to him to see if he was okay, but he didn't respond. But he just kept sobbing, ever so softly. But it started to sound different. It was almost childlike. I started to get worried and kept trying to get his attention, but he wouldn't respond. So I began making my way towards him, thinking that he just might have hurt himself. And that's when I heard it. "David, are you yelling at me? Is everything okay?" I turned around to see Hector peeking under the house from the access point, looking confused. But how could he? How is he? Behind me? My blood turned to ice and I immediately went stiff. Who the hell is in front of me? Crying. I slowly turned my head back around. It felt like every bone in my neck and spine was breaking from the tension. The crying got louder and louder, and I felt like it took every fiber of my being to turn around and look at who was in front of me. Hector yelled again from behind me. Dude, what's wrong? I felt a presence gaining on me, and I slowly inched my gaze back around in front of me. You know when someone walks in the room and you don't hear them, but you just know? It felt like that. The air was thick, and my heart was pounding out of my chest. Every thought I ever had about ghosts, demons, just the paranormal in general, came flooding in and made me feel sick. I was stuck. My head was half cocked and my body was stiff as a board. Then I felt breathing on my neck. It was warm and humid, and it smelled awful. It smelled like something was rotting. I can only compare the smell to a dead animal. It was the scariest moment of my life. After a few moments, I gathered enough courage to look. I counted to 3 and shot my head back around, preparing my eyes to see whatever monstrosity laid before me. I jumped back as I turned my head in one quick motion, and there was nothing. There was nothing there. What the fuck? Hector eventually began making his way in. He reached me and tapped me on the back. It caught me off guard, and I tore from underneath the house as fast as I could and ran back to the truck. Hector was confused and followed me back and eventually caught up to me. I tried to explain what happened, but he just blew me off and acted like I was messing with him. I didn't push the issue more than I needed to since I didn't want to be known as the crazy guy. But it didn't matter. The next day when my alarm went off, I shut it down and never went back into work. That was the last day I worked for L&R Comfort, and I don't think I would ever go back. What the hell was that thing? Or was it just my imagination?
It's What's on the Inside, written by Drac MCV. Such a fragile thing is the mind. For all its magnificence, it will crack as easily as frozen whisper given the right pressure. For me, it started as innocently as getting locked in my bathroom. A faulty door handle was to blame, a shitty piece of metal. It was a particularly hot shower that night, and the tiny room was filled with the stagnant, wet air. The muscles along my spine heaved to bring the slightest hint of fresh air into my lungs. Hot, wet air. I breathed. I wasn't just in a panic, I was the embodiment of the word. The wall seemed to close in and I broke. Nausea twisted my guts until fear took over, and with all my strength, I broke the doorknob with my bare hands. I scrambled into the dark hallway. Fresh air rocketed into my lungs like the vacuum of deep space into a punctured hull. It was then I realised of what I was truly made. I couldn't fall asleep for many nights following. When my eyes shut, the nausea and panic returned. The growing fissure in my mind turned every setting into that bedroom. At first it was just my bedroom, then the living room. Finally, I wasn't even safe from myself in my own home. Every room filled with choking steam, wet knobs. My feet without traction on the floor. The remnants of my sanity assured me it was an illusion, but the panic was crippling. I started sleeping outside. That's when I realised what being trapped truly meant. The open air and empty space overhead wasn't enough to calm me. The fence around my yard was the next barrier that seemed to be closing in. The steam followed me everywhere. I imagined the river at the edge of town rising up like a great fall of water, decapitating any escape attempt. Hot steam, as thick as putty, crawling over the only road to freedom and fresh air. But what if I got past the river? What then? More land? More rising hills? Avalanching steam? More hot breaths? More crying lungs? All possible roads would eventually end at the ocean. The broiling ocean and its suffocating waves. I would surely drown just looking at it. The blackness of empty space was my only hope. I could escape to where nothing exists. My mind cracked. What if nothing is not a void, but a black canvas? Blacklit by needle holes of an unreachable freedom. Surely, the steam would follow me there as well. Trapped, suffocating, suicide was not an option. What if my soul was trapped in my corpse for eternity? Panic. Nausea. Death is not freedom. It was then I found a loophole. My soul lives under my skin, my flesh and my bones. If I freed my soul without the claustrophobia of death, then I would truly be free. The knife must remain sharp and my cuts true, lest I bleed out before I escape.
I pulled the thin chain that hung above the floor. The flickering ball barely lit the area around where I was standing. The basement was filthy with years of neglect, but the area underneath his feet was wiped nearly clean. I've long since stopped flinching every time he yanks and strains against the ropes binding him to the chair in front of me. After all this time, I'm surprised he's still trying to free himself. The first sign of bed sores peek out from underneath his bare thighs, and he's covered in his own vomit. I can only assume the wet stench of rot got the better of him. I don't even notice it anymore. Honestly, I've lost track of how long I've had him down here. I slide the burlap sack off his face. It's soaked with spit and sweat. He's not yelling this time. No screams for freedom. No curses at me to let him go. No pathetic begging. Just acceptance. There's an anticipation in his eyes. Surrounded by swollen gray lids, they beckon his eventual end. His death that I will keep at bay for as long as possible. I cannot let myself get all emotional about this. Death would be too favorable an outcome. He doesn't even look at me anymore. His eyes only stare to the opposite edge of the light where another person sits, covered in a fine, white sheet. I was worried he finally stopped caring about his situation until I took a couple steps toward the other chair. He winced, averting his eyes to the more comfortable darkness everywhere else. "Please," he said, "I know you're not letting me go. Just kill me." "Then I'd have to worry about hiding your body," I replied, grabbing the sheet and giving it a pull. "What do you want from me?" he asked pathetically. "You, of all people, should understand what I'm doing," I said, having fully uncovered my wife's corpse, the bruises on her face and surrounding her neck frozen in the perpetuity of death. "I'm sorry." There's the begging I'm used to. "You don't get to be sorry," I said like a well-known fact. He began to cry, a weak attempt to garner my sympathetic side. That's a piece of my personality I learned to hide away only a day after I caught him. You always hear how serial killers are so charismatic, and I refuse to let him manipulate my humanity. I refuse to feel anything but vindication. "How many more would you have killed, John?" I asked him, lightly feathering my wife's wiry hair. "If I hadn't walked in on you, how many more wives would have ended up like my own?" "Just kill me," he whimpered. "Oh, you will die, John." I tried to sound comforting. "But not until you atone for the 14 that came before her." I grabbed my sledgehammer and spread his toes on the floor in front of me.
I'm a 32-year-old female, and this is something that happened to me only 2 nights ago. My husband Kevin and I were on the porch smoking a cigarette. It was about 9 o'clock at night. We live in the woods, right off a stretch of a highway that's between 2 interstate exits. We were looking up at the stars, enjoying the quiet atmospheres of the crickets. Glad to have temporary relief from all the usual traffic noise. I heard something and shushed my husband, even though he hadn't said anything. Was that screaming? Yes, it was a woman screaming like nothing I had ever heard before. It sounded like she was getting murdered. In between blood-chilling screams, she was screaming out, "Help me! Help me!" I look at my husband. We were both really freaked out. The more she screamed, the closer she was getting to the house. I could eventually see a figure running along the median of the highway, making their way closer to the part of the highway that was in front of our house. Our house is a good ways back from the driveway, but not far enough that you can't see anything. If we could see her, that meant she could see us. Me being selfish and worrying about my 3 children in the house, one of which is a newborn, I turned the porch lights off. We had no yard security lights, so we were in the complete darkness. We could still see the highway perfectly fine due to the house across of us still having their Christmas lights up. I threw my cigarette in my yard and back up to stand in the doorway of my house, pulling out my phone to call 911. She's still in the median of the road, screaming. If anyone else in the surrounding houses heard her, they pretended like they didn't. Kevin runs past me inside and gets his jacket and shoes. I tell him not to go out there, but he ignores me and gets dressed anyways. As soon as he is out of sight, I see a red car barrel up the road and pull over next to where the lady was at. With her in the median, there was still a stretch of highway between them. There was a man driving. I couldn't see what he looked like. I only heard his voice. He was yelling that he was going to kill her and calling her a bitch. It looked like he was throwing stuff at her out of the window, maybe clothes. As soon as she sees him pull over, she starts running straight towards our yard. By that time I was already on the phone with the police officers, but as I said, I live out in the woods, pretty far out of town I'll add, so it would take them a bit to get here. I yell for my husband. I tell my 9-year-old son to go in our room where my baby is and close the door. He can hear the whole thing and was pretty frightened. My husband runs out onto the porch and into the yard towards her. He asks if she's okay and she says that she had gotten a ride from this guy, and halfway down the road he started acting really creepy. He refused to let her out where she told him to and kept driving with her in the car. She looked behind her seat pretending to look at a car behind them and saw a roll of duct tape. Fearing for her life, she jumped out of a moving car and just started running down the road, screaming for help. Kevin starts to lead her towards the house and by now is also on the phone with the police, having gathered more information that I wasn't able to give them when I had called. They told him to stay on the line with them until an officer showed up. He lets her in the house and her face looks terrible. She is red and bleeding in a couple of spots, road rash from when she jumped out. She also said that he had hit her before she was able to escape. She came in and we locked our door, knob, deadbolt and chain. We stood together near the window waiting for the police to show up. Kevin giving updates and answering questions on the phone. No, they haven't gotten here yet. Yes, his car is still parked across the highway. It's a red sedan in front of a house with lots of blue porch Christmas lights, he told them. I was trying not to lose my shit when there was a loud bang on our door. The man was yelling,
"I know you're in there. I saw you running. The people in there can't protect you."
I shouted through the door that he needed to leave our property if he was smart, get in his car and drive off. I told him we were on the phone with the police. The answer he gave me was one of the worst I could ever imagine. He says,
"Go ahead, call the police. I don't care. They won't be here in time."
All along while banging on the door over and over. The woman was freaking out, crying, saying, "Help me, please, help me," over and over again. I ran to the kitchen to get a large knife just in case. We had a huge solid iron door, but our windows were easily breakable. If he wanted to get in badly enough, he certainly could. My husband just came back from our bedroom with his gun when a squad car pulled up in the yard, 2 more following behind it and 1 across the street where his car was. He took off on foot, running. They tended to the woman and got her home safely. Turns out she lives across the highway just 5 houses down from us to the left. It's been 2 days now, as I stated in the beginning, and they still haven't found him. There's a lot of places to hide in the woods. I just hope he hides far away from here.
I see them. I see them all, delicate and fragile, nearing the fulfillment of their purpose. A chorus of anguish resounds throughout the retirement home, throwing the staff into a chaotic state. Before they understand what is transpiring, they begin to harmonize with the rest of the choir, screaming and writhing upon the floor. All of them, but one. One nurse remains set apart from the rest. Perhaps the choir was full and had no need of her anguish. Or maybe something else was needed of her. She runs down a hallway in desperation as she witnesses a coworker fall to the ground in a screaming tantrum. When she reaches her friend, she falls to her knees beside her. The countless screams pierce her ears from all directions as she attempts to assist her friend who continues to cry out, ignoring her efforts completely. She yells her name and tries to hold her in place, but her efforts prove to be in vain. After multiple failed attempts to help her in any way, the nurse takes notice of yet another strange occurrence. Her friend's mouth seems to be opening wider and wider and wider. She can't help but intently observe this until she flinches when her friend's jaw makes a distinct popping noise. Horrified, she desperately tries to look her friend in the eyes while yelling her name. That's when she witnesses the eyes widen as well, widening to a point where anyone would believe they were going to detach. In perfect unison, the screaming stops, even from her friend who now lies limp upon the ground, with her mouth still agape and her eyes nearly unseating themselves from their sockets. The nurse carefully puts her ear to her friend's chest and listens for a breath or a heartbeat, but her body is as silent and still as the rest of the building. She rises from the floor and gazes at the lifeless body as tears run down her face. She cautiously walks down the rest of the hallway and pulls out her phone with trembling hands. She locates the nearest stairwell and closes the doors behind her. The call is made. Officers are on their way, and fear takes hold of her as she curls up in a corner at the bottom of the stairs. Poor little thing. Shame you must live through this. A cold, empty silence dominates the corridors of the building. The lone nurse dares not make a sound or move. She remains. She remains. 2 police officers arrive and enter the building to discover a rather uninspiring scene. No one greets them, no sounds to be heard, and no signs of the panicked caller. They begin their search and discover the aftermath of the tragedy. All they find are corpses, until they come upon the nurse, curled up upon the floor at the foot of the main staircase. "Ma'am?" the officer questions. "Ma'am, are you injured?" The officer carefully approaches her and reaches to help the frightened creature. She recoils as he makes his first attempt to help her up, and when he tries again, she slowly unravels herself and allows the officer to help. The officer assists the nurse out of the building and radios that he found the caller. "What's your name?" The nurse quietly answers, "Avery." The cool evening breeze of summer caresses her as she speaks her name. "Can you tell me what happened, Avery?" the officer calmly asks. In a trembling voice, she answers, I'm not sure what happened. Just that it was bad. Very bad." He nods. Okay, is there anyone else we can speak to?" "I don't know," she answers before choking up some more. "Okay, well, you're safe now. Someone will be here soon that can help you." She nods as he helps her into his squad car, and then he returns to the building. Police continue to discover disturbing scenes as they enter each room of the retirement home. Every corpse they find possesses the same characteristics as the last. Mouths so agape that jaws are dislocated, eyes held open at their widest points, giving the false impression of their imminent detachment from their sockets. Each victim, each human being, staring intently into the unknown, searching for the answer to the age-old question, why are we here? Except this time, they received an answer, and it horrified them. An ambulance arrives and EMTs bring the nurse in to ensure she is physically unharmed. While she is examined, she struggles to hold back tears. An EMT reassures her with kind, soft-spoken words, but they know not what she has seen. Even a legion of comforts could not heal her mind of its scars. While the authorities continue investigating, Avery's mother arrives. Her mother finds a parking spot among the multiple police cars in the parking lot, and then quickly exits her car to locate her daughter. Once Avery and her mother lock eyes, they both run to each other and embrace. "Are you okay? I came as soon as they called me." Her mother's words immediately soothe her soul as she clings to her with no intention of letting go. "I am. I'm not hurt or anything, just scared." Her mother holds onto her and does her best to calm her weeping child. Okay, I'm here now, I'm here." Here they stand, both full of fear. One fears for the other, and the other fears her own memory, the memory of the sounds and the sights she witnessed this night. "I'll take you home with me, okay?" Avery relaxes her arms and looks into her mother's loving eyes and nods. "All right, let's go." With one arm wrapped around her daughter, Avery's mother walks her to the car and takes her away from what Avery will now label as the birthplace of her worst nightmares. Once at home, Avery's mother prepares the guest bedroom while Avery changes her clothes. The healing of the mind sometimes requires silence. Avery's mother knows this. She prepares some tea and offers it to her daughter without speaking. Her daughter receives it, sitting on the living room couch under some blankets. As she takes a sip, her mother seats herself next to her on the couch and cuddles up beside her. She feels how much her daughter is shaking and no longer can keep silent. "You're shaking. Are you cold? Are you still scared?" Avery barely makes an effort to nod in response. "Can you tell me anything yet, or do you need more time?" After taking another sip of tea, Avery looks over to her mother. "I'm afraid time will never be enough." Her mother proceeds to comfort her. "Well, if time won't help, then perhaps talking will. Can you try? For me? I'm afraid I'll just make you as afraid as I am, and I don't want that." Mothers are always afraid for their children. You should know that already. But I can leave you be if that's what you want. Avery manages a small smile and takes another sip of the warm, soothing tea her mother made her. This was enough comfort alone. Her mother gets up to get ready for bed, leaving Avery to enjoy her tea in silence in the warming atmosphere of the home she grew up in. Upon finishing her tea, she decides to sleep on the couch and prepares to fall asleep while she still feels safe and warm. Avery. A male voice, soft and clear, enters her ears with no discernible direction of origin. She sits up, her heart racing, and her eyes dart in every direction. "Don't be afraid. Shh, please. Calm yourself. Relax." Strangely, she suddenly begins to feel herself calm and no longer fear the disembodied voice. "Your mind is not being tricked. nor tricking you. I am real. You are hearing my voice. Please, listen to what I have to say. Much depends on you to listen. So please, hear my voice. Avery remains silent and gently lays back on the couch and listens. I am speaking to you now because you have witnessed what is to come. The future is filled with dark times, times of hunger, sickness, and madness. Yes, these are common predictions, spoken of by those who stray from sanity, which is why most are not prepared for these times when they come to pass. I need you to be my voice. I need you to relay this warning. They must know what you saw before it's too late. Yes, they may doubt you at first, until the things you warn of come to pass. They will see you as a prophet, and together we will save the human race from itself. That is, if you decide to act. Avery then abruptly wakes up, sweating and breathing heavily. She sits up and notices a picture on the wall and wonders why her mother has the same picture as her. Then she looks down and sees her own bed sheets, then her own bed, and realizes she's still in her own home. She scrambles out of bed and checks the date on the phone. Relief and terror both occupy her mind as she comes to the troubling conclusion none of what she experienced last night has taken place yet. This story has been read by Nyx. Check out my channel, Penny Dreadful Moment, and subscribe to become a Dreadful. Now remember, don't be afraid of the dark. Be terrified of what is in it. Until next time.
Greetings, Janet. I trust you are well. Please, before you so quickly press the to spam button, let me assure you that I'm writing directly to you. Janet Anderson of 12 Oak Ridge Lane, Shaughnessy, Massachusetts. You are 42 years old, have a cat named Rascal, and have just spilled tea on yourself. Go ahead and clean up. I'll wait. In the meantime, if your name happens to be Janet Anderson, and you do not fit the rest of the description above, please do accept my apologies if any of what follows is disturbing to you. This does not concern or affect you, or anyone else who may happen upon this. Choose to continue reading at your own discretion. Welcome back, Janet. You know, you really shouldn't be drinking green tea so late at night. That sort of thing is going to keep you awake to all hours. Well, perhaps not tonight. You do need to focus, dear, or this really is going to take much longer to get through than either of us wants. Let me start with why I am writing you. You recall, I'm sure, your old manager, Mr. George Dalrymple? I'm quite sure you do. He passed away, quite suddenly, last spring. The poor, intolerable man suffered from a very unexpected case of heart failure, alone at his home on the Cape. And to think the young lad was only 34. It was quite a shock to the entire office, I'm sure. In the end, though, not such a shock to Mr. Dalrymple, nor to you, Janet. Please do try to stop leaving your computer. I'd rather not have to force you to stay. As I was saying, your old boss has been gone now for almost a year. Likely no one cares anymore, but I care, Janet. I care because lack of payment for my services rendered makes me, let's just say, emotional. I'll cut right to the chase. Last spring, you sought out help from someone. You used an encrypted anonymous Tor network to access a website, where you placed an advertisement for a service. That service was to rid the planet of Mr. George Dalrymple, in a method that would appear to others as natural causes, for the full sum of $10,000. I answered that ad. I performed those services. I was not paid. As I do not believe you possess the funds necessary to fill your end of our agreement, consider this letter your payment. Now, Janet, why did you have to go and do that? Did you think shutting the lid to your laptop was going to make this all go away? Now I have no choice but to make you stay. Go ahead and try to turn away. You'll see now that it's futile. You cannot stop reading this letter. Not anymore. You have to stay, and we'll read this through. I'll give you a chance to wipe your tears and clean your glasses. Janet, I have what you might call a curse. Some might call it a gift, but it's really a curse. It's a curse that's contagious in a way. I don't mean that I pass on my curse to others. That would be terribly irresponsible. This is a different kind of curse I pass on. It's sort of like that manga called Death Note, or maybe that book and movie The Never-Ending Story. Only those are silly and completely fictional, and I have to work at this a bit more to get just right. You are reading now your fate. Bear with me. I have to provide as many details with as much flair as possible in order for this to work correctly. The slight shuffling you hear behind you now is a man entering your home. He is large, bearded, and smells of garbage. He does not know why he chose here or now to rob someone, but he has no choice. He does not expect anyone to be in the apartment. You sit perfectly still at your desk in the dark, focused intently on your laptop screen. Tears continue to blur your vision as you try desperately to tear yourself away from reading the rest of this letter. You're wondering now why you wished your boss to die so badly that it would end like this. Was he really so wrong to think you shouldn't be promoted? Sure, you were angry. Did he have to die for it? You weren't exactly an exemplary employee, spending so much time reading trashy websites and checking personal email instead of working. The smell of garbage is stronger now, joined by the definite odor of gin-soaked breath. A board creaked just outside your bedroom door, as the man is startled to see he was wrong in thinking he was alone. He's reaching into his pocket now, where he'd placed the flathead screwdriver he used to pry your window open. He can't believe how still you are. Why isn't she reacting? He's thinking. But he has no choice. He must act now. You remain still. He's rushing up behind you, grasping the top of your head with one hand, while sinking the screwdriver into the base of your neck with the other. He tried to angle his stab upward into your brain, so you'd die quickly and quietly, painlessly, but he's drunk and he's clumsy. You can feel the screwdriver turning just behind your tongue, the blood pouring through the hole and down your throat. Something's making a scraping sound, the metal of the screwdriver against bits of broken skull, yet you keep reading, because you have to. The man removed the screwdriver. You've never experienced such pain before in your life. Do not worry though, it's not over yet. You're trying to grasp for breath, but it won't come. Your limbs are beginning to twitch violently, convulse. You're fading now, your sight growing dim. You're straining to read what comes next. The man is once more driving the screwdriver higher into your head. This time it connects well. Now it ends. Sincerely, D.
It's been 10 years, and I still find myself remembering. That kind of horror has a way of permanently dyeing a man's perspective. It changes you and informs your every waking decision. My head was spinning, the room was dark, and I could make out the faint squeak of the ceiling fan. I tried to gasp for air, but it felt like I was breathing through a straw. And the little air I could pull in only intensified the horrible pain in my chest. Panicking, I tried to drag myself to my feet using the arm of the nearby recliner, but my body felt pinned to the earth. Or tried to scream for my family, A broken croak was all I heard. Desperately, I clawed at the ground, at the chair, and even at my throat. But I couldn't move. In this moment, all I knew was that I didn't want to die. I couldn't bear to leave my daughter without a dad. She deserved better. As my fear increased, tears began to well in my eyes. I didn't want to die. I really, really didn't want to die. In my sorrow and manic attempts to free myself, I suddenly became uncomfortably aware of something crawling within my shirt. It was small and had many legs, but was unlike any insect or spider I had ever known. Every sharp, delicate step pricked my skin, leaving an awful feeling of residue behind. And the touch, it was so cold, so horrifying cold, but worst of all, it made this ominous buzzing or creaking with every minute movement. It finally stopped and rested upon the end of my neck. It seemed to lay its body down, pressing itself close to my skin. As it did so, I felt something long and thin vibrating from near the back of the thing. Whimpering and gasping for any air I could get, I was scared to death. However, that wasn't it. I could feel more of them crawling on my skin. Don't know where they were coming from, but they began to swarm me. From where I lay, I could barely make out the image of my clothes writhing from where the creatures crawled beneath. I was now crying, at least as much as I could given the lack of oxygen. The way their prickly bodies tickled my skin made me nauseous. And then, a sound unlike anything natural stood my hairs on end. It sounded like what you might expect the devil himself would. I could feel the unholy screech resound within my stomach, the same way a marching band might. From the corner of my eye, where I heard the scream, I saw my wall begin to shimmer and divide, and from within it came some elongated, misshapen beast. I could only barely make out its dark silhouette as it began to slowly make its way toward me. God! The way its body cracked and popped as it moved, the soft, rhythmic hiss. As it got nearer, thoughts of intense sorrow and malice overtook me, followed by the most depressing hatred a man could possibly feel. Just kill me, I thought. God damn it all, kill me. Kill me. Please fucking kill me. That was always the scariest. It wasn't the creature, but the way it made you feel. The way it made you want to abandon everyone and everything just to rid yourself of the thoughts. The closer it drew, the more frenzied the crawling things began to vibrate and chirp, drowning out my own muffled moans. Eventually, the creature rested right above me, staring at me. Hell, staring right through me. The buzzing grew louder as the creatures descended upon my face. I felt them crawl across my closed eyes and dangerously close to my ear. I tried to force my mouth closed. I couldn't let them crawl inside, but the creature reached down and placed its cold wet hand upon my chest. Immediately, I felt my heart palpitate and pulse. I let out a scream, a horrifying scream that was immediately drowned out as the things began to climb inside my mouth and crawl throughout my throat. And the way they felt, my God, I'll never forget. Their rough skin ripped at the inside of my throat, leaving a blood-in raw. And the way they tasted, and the horrible sounds of scratching as they rummaged through my skull. Eventually, my mouth was forced open as wide as it could go as they all poured inside my body, leaving my insides cold and literally crawling. Don't kill my family. Don't kill my wife. Don't kill my daughter. Don't kill me. Those were the last things I remembered thinking. When I woke up on the very same floor, the ceiling fan still creaking. Afterwards, I was told that I had a heart attack. When I tried to tell people what happened, obviously they didn't believe me. And there's no reason they should. I was just some delusional, dying old man. And if I'm to be entirely honest, I don't even know if I believe it. Even till this very day, the memory is still as fresh as before. I can no longer tolerate the feeling of anything crawling on my skin. Now I have a terrifying fear of bugs climbing into my mouth as I sleep. I'm even sure I can sometimes hear the horrible buzzing and an unholy screech as I lay awake at night. I'll never forget that night and the terrifying occurrence. But I also could never thank God enough for waking me from that nightmare and for allowing me to see my daughter grow up.
Although I've heard many stories from my uncle about his time as an EMT, this is the story that will stick with me until I die. About 6 years ago, my Uncle Vinny's paramedic crew responded to a call from a hotel in Philly, and it was one of the more horrific experiences he had. The initial report stated that a maintenance man named Mike went to check on room 417 since water had been reported flooding into the hallway, and it was he who found the body. Mike informed 911 that there was a man in the in-suit hot tub who appeared to be deceased, and he was all but hyperventilating as he tried to make his report. Mike relayed that he saw the man and immediately backed out of the room, being careful not to drop his cell phone into the several inches of water on the floor. My uncle's two-man paramedic team entered the room about 12 minutes later, and they almost gagged at the smell of feces and burning flesh. Vinny, who has a stomach of steel, had to press his hand on his mouth to keep him from vomiting. The room was filled with steam, and the humidity was instantly making the men sweat profusely. Their grip on their equipment was slipping, and they knew they needed to extract the victim quickly. The naked man was floating in the hot tub, a maniacal grin plastered across his face. From the looks of it, the man had been in the water for a while, since his bruised skin was starting to peel off, and his body in long, squishy stripes. Vinny held his breath and checked for vitals while one of the other EMTs went to go get a bag for the body. Even though my uncle saw corpses regularly, this method of death was a disturbing first for him, and something about the whole situation was unnerving. As Vinny placed his fingers on the man's wrist, expecting to feel nothing, he had to choke back on a startled scream when the victim's hand shot out and grasped his arm. It wasn't a corpse. The John Doe didn't even show any other signs of being responsive, but when the other EMT went to check on the man's eyes for a dilation reaction, his pupils looked slitted, almost like those of a reptile. Vinny was weirded out, but dismissed it as a side effect of getting boiled alive like a hard-boiled egg. As the man removed the victim from the hot tub, the man began to thrash, strips of flesh splattering at the EMTs. They tried to pin the man down to keep him from hurting himself, but he was shockingly strong. As the last bit of flesh dropped to the floor, Vinny saw that it wasn't more skin underneath. It was scales. His partner must have noticed too, because both men began screaming almost in unison. The thing began to growl, and my uncle's normal desire to figure out problems turned into a sheer fight-or-flight response, with flight winning out. He ran from the hotel room, his teammates on his heels. They slammed the door behind them, and a moment later they heard one of the windows shatter. They were told to say that a John Doe tried to drown himself, and that the mentally unhinged man climbed down the fire escape when his attempt failed. Vinny, who was paid extra well to keep his mouth shut, never did tell anyone about his story until he shared it with me the other day. I could tell he didn't want to, but I was the only one in the family that he thought would believe him. The only reason he even shared this ridiculous story is because he thinks something has been stalking him the last few weeks, and he's worried that the creature has returned. I thought he was crazy until I went to his house yesterday and saw a trail of bipedal clawed footprints underneath his windowsill. Now my uncle is missing, and I think I'm the only one that really knows what happened to him.
What can I say about Solitude, Alaska? Summers were all about character building, the kind of experience adults lament children don't have today, complete with hard physical labor. When we weren't doing chores, we enjoyed relatively unsupervised exploration of the wilderness near Wrangell Street, Elias National Park and Preserve. This was back in the 90s. Solitude was named for a small creek that ran behind the log cabins. Granddaddy prided Solitude on its no-frills accommodations, much to our chagrin. I can't exactly explain where it is without outing myself, but I used to spend my summers there as a kid with my younger brother Nick. We hated it. As an adult, I realized how much money these summers away saved our mom. She was single and struggling to raise 2 wild kids, and summer daycare was, and is, ridiculously expensive. Summers with Granddaddy gave her a much-needed break and enabled us to spend time with our extended family, mostly Granddaddy. The rest of the year, he lived in a remote town and was rarely able to visit. Every year, I begged not to go. Once we were there, we had a good time, but Granddaddy was a lot less lenient than Mom, and he often reminded us of that with weird punishments and scare tactics. I'm prefacing my stories with this fact, not because he was abusive, but because I realized a couple of these weird stories could be explained by my brother or Granddaddy messing with me. I'll let you be the judge. Our morning started with a huge breakfast in the lodge and 2 cups of black coffee, non-negotiable. After breakfast, we split firewood. After firewood was cut and stacked, Granddaddy would have us pile into the back of a trailer hitched to a 3-wheeler and drive us out towards the runway so we could hunt for squirrels. Granddaddy hated squirrels, but he had a good reason. Aside from snow machines in the winter, the only way to reach Solitude was by bush plane. The family maintained a clearing where the planes could land, an effort that the park's squirrels constantly thwarted by digging holes in the runway. The holes were a huge hazard that were known to cause wrecks. If the landing gear caught in one of the holes, the plane would flip onto its nose, and the results could be fatal. The remains of an old red and white Cessna were a constant reminder of that fact. The wreckage was far too big to haul off the remote property, so the plane was moved off to the side of the runway, where it was only partially obscured by trees. The plane had been there since my mom was a kid and had long been claimed by nature. Although Nick and I complained incessantly about our other chores, we never complained about squirrel hunting. We each were equipped with child-sized .22 rifles and driven around the field looking for squirrels to shoot and holes to fill with heavy stones we collected from the creek. Before you ask, Granddaddy was all about gun safety and had us memorize the rules of gun ownership by heart. On the drives, he'd ask us to recite the rules and give us spankings if we even jokingly aimed the guns anywhere we shouldn't. To this day, I still remember the cardinal rule. Rule number 1. All guns are always loaded. We were only trusted to shoot squirrels at first, but we got pretty good at it. It was quite an introduction to the messiness of death. When squirrels die, like most animals, they immediately shit themselves. After we did a few runs around the field, we'd head back to camp and skin the bodies, even grosser than the poop. While Granddaddy hated squirrels, I started to fear them. At first, I was just grossed out. Squirrels are a lot less cute, skinned and gutted, but Granddaddy insisted we couldn't be wasteful. This rule applied to any kill, from squirrels to bears. We had to use or give away any usable parts. To do anything less was considered extremely disrespectful to the animal. One afternoon, after we got back from a squirrel hunt, I reluctantly grabbed one of the dead squirrels. This parky squirrel had suffered a messy gut shot, its innards protruding. The stink was awful. Once I set it down on a stump and knelt down to skin it, it moved. I let out a shriek and jumped away while my little brother turned around to see what I was screaming about. The squirrel wasn't dead. It jumped up to its feet and stared at me with beady black eyes, then lunged for an attack. I ran away while my brother jumped towards it and started stomping on it. In situations like that, younger or not, he was braver than I was. Nick stomped on the squirrel a few times, but even after he swore it was dead, I refused to go near it. He ended up skinning it for me. After that, I was definitely much more eager to just fill the squirrel holes in instead. But this story doesn't end there. It ended with something we called tundra skiing. One of us would stand behind the trailer and grab onto it. Taking turns, we'd let the three-wheeler drag us along the trailer while trying to stay upright. It was fun at first, skiing on the slippery soles of our rain boots. We did it for a few afternoons before an accident inevitably happened. Granddaddy strongly believed in letting kids make mistakes, so when we started the game, he went along with it. He drove pretty slow and kept an eye on us, so it could have been a lot worse. It was my turn, so I was being dragged along and having a grand time, until my foot got caught in one of the squirrel holes. I didn't react fast enough, so I was still holding on to the trailer when I fell. Unfortunately, no one saw the barbed wire hidden in the mossy overgrowth. My left leg raked across it right before Granddaddy realized I was down and braked. It happened so fast. I didn't even scream, just let out a whimpering yelp. My leg has a scar to this day because I refused to let Granddaddy give me stitches. He was a trained paramedic. We were nowhere near a hospital. The cut was deep, but not life-threatening. I remember being hysterical, blood getting everywhere when my granddaddy used a pair of tweezers to pull moss and debris out of the open wound and did his best to sterilize it, despite the thrashing and screaming of his granddaughter. I was more scared than hurt, but in my defense, I was an elementary school kid. After that, I was embarrassed and distracted by my injury, so I didn't tell Granddaddy that I'd felt something in the hole. When my foot caught, I felt the sensation of thick, cold fingers curl tightly around my ankle. They didn't let go. The force of being dragged behind the three-wheelers pulled me free. In that moment of fear, pain, and adrenaline, the detail took a back seat. Even at that age, I tried to convince myself I'd imagined it. Memory of the hand made me sleep hard the rest of the summer. Even today, I can't help but wonder if that squirrel hole was ever filled in. All I know for sure is there were more than squirrels hiding in those holes.